Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome virtually to the Palais des Nations in Geneva. My name is David Chikvaidze. I'm Chef de Cabinet of the Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva, commonly referred to by its acronym UNOG. And I have the daunting privilege of chairing the opening session of this joint conference of UNOG and the World Academy of Art and Science, Global Leadership for the 21st Century. This is the culmination of a one-year joint project to develop cross-sectoral strategies for addressing current global leadership challenges. At the outset, I wish to recognize the Director General of UNOG, our host and my boss, Ms. Tatiana Valovaya, who will shortly officially open our conference. Excuse me. It is my pleasure to also recognize the other co-chair of our conference, and without much exaggeration, truly the father of this project, President and CEO of the World Academy of Art and Science, Mr. Gary Jacobs. The second wave of COVID around the world made it impossible for Gary Jacobs to travel to Geneva, as it did for many other participants. So the entire event today and tomorrow is virtual. Let me note here that another victim of this situation is multilingualism, which we always try to uphold as a minimum with respect to the second working language of the UN, French. But it proved impossible, so the entire conference will be in English. The Director General of UNOG and the President of WAAS are pleased and honored to be joined for this opening session by two outstanding women leaders, former President of the Swiss Confederation, Ms. Micheline Calmire, and former President of Latvia, Ms. Vaida Vike Freiberga. Who better than two democratic former heads of state to project into the future the requirements for dynamic and efficient global leadership for the rest of the 21st century, and together with the Director General of UNOG and the President of the World Academy to set the tone for this conference. I would also like to warmly welcome the participants of our conference, diplomats, UN colleagues, civil society actors, journalists, members of the academic institutions, and youth representatives. Over 700 persons registered for this conference, and we look forward to your active participation. My appreciation also goes to our main partners, among them the Nizami Gyanjavi International Center, the Club of Rome, the Global Security Institute, and many, many others. We're gratified that some of the brightest minds in science, diplomacy, civic action, and other fields accepted our invitation to discuss how to fill the gaps in global leadership at this critical juncture in human history. Without taking up more time, I wish to present our first speaker, the Director General of UNOG, Undersecretary General Tatiana Valovaya. You are the first woman to occupy this position. An academic and practitioner yourself, you've been a leader in multilateralism for years. International Geneva has come to appreciate your skillful leadership of UN Geneva, facilitating diplomacy in the 21st century, while at the same time navigating us through the impact of the pandemic. No mean achievement. Director General, it's my pleasure to invite you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to the Palais des Nations in Geneva, though virtually. It's a place where diverse expertise from all fields is gathered, where international organizations, governments, civil society, academia, and private sector closely work together, and where lots of bright ideas flourish. It is a great pleasure to co-host such a high-profile event which combines a wealth of knowledge from all disciplines. I would like to thank our numerous partners and experts whose contributions, papers, and panel discussions laid the intellectual foundation of this conference. I would like to thank our esteemed co-host, the World Academy of Art and Science, for this excellent collaboration, and personally, the President and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Gary Jacobs, and his fantastic team. The World Academy of Art and Science was founded in 1960 by outstanding scientists who wanted to harness their knowledge for the good of all and who were concerned about the devastating effects that the misuse of science could have. Academy fellows are pioneers in their fields and strong advocates for issues such as democracy and global governance, international security and peace, climate change, global health, education, and equality. Our partnership with the World Academy of Art and Science has been a long and successful one, born out of the deep desire to better utilize the findings of science to jointly address global social challenges. Our work has many overlapping areas, and it was only a logical step to let it culminate in a great project like this. When we started this project over a year ago, the task we gave ourselves and our partners was already complex: to develop global leadership strategies for social progress in the 21st century. The project is born of the complex nexus of global challenges that we are facing today: a devastating climate crisis, armed conflicts around the world, dire poverty and rampant global inequalities, deep global mistrust and trade disputes, as well as repeated attacks on the media. The seeming inability of the international community to re-engage and work together to stem these global challenges has revealed a vacuum of meaningful global leadership. And these challenges were already evident before a global pandemic swept across our planet. At that time, we could not foresee how a microscopic virus would reinforce the importance of our work. UN Secretary General Guterres evoked a powerful image when he compared the pandemic to an X-ray that laid bare existing fragilities in our societies. Global change is continuing at record speed and complexity, increasing uncertainty, especially for the most vulnerable. We are faced with urgent ecological challenges, and we are lagging behind in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our challenges are coupled with a dangerous retreat from multilateralism that renders conventional leadership models ineffective or even potentially obsolete. We need more active global leadership and transformative strategies for our future. The United Nations has started a global spanning discussion this year. On the occasion of our 75th anniversary, we reached out to the people through dialogues, and several of them were held in virtual and hybrid forums here in Geneva, and surveys. And we asked citizens what kind of future and what kind of the United Nations they want and need. The majority of the respondents see the value of cooperation to solve the challenges ahead of us, from global health to climate change and conflicts. An important priority for them is to rethink our social and economic system, to build a more inclusive version of it, and to rebalance the relationship between economic growth, environment, and public priorities. For the vast majority of people, solidarity, multilateralism, and international cooperation are the most important tools for this work. Today's conference, therefore, comes at an ideal time, and the result of the UN 75 initiative will be an important impulse for the ongoing discussions. The aim of the next 2 days is to go beyond assessing the status quo and to articulate active strategies for sustainable global leadership, including for the workings of the United Nations and its partners. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I am looking forward to many inspiring discussions with brilliant ideas for a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director General, for your welcome and your perspective on the synergies needed to reach our goal. It is now my privilege to turn to Ms. Micheline Calmiret, former President and former Foreign Minister of Switzerland, who has long been at the forefront of multilateralism, diplomacy, human rights, gender, and intercultural dialogue. Today, as Professor of the Global Studies Institute of the University of Geneva, you form young minds and continue to actively support democratic leadership. You are our major resident asset in Geneva, and we're very pleased that you could join us today. is my privilege to invite you to speak.
Merci. Madame la Directrice Générale, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of our conference is leadership in the 21st century, as well as the future of multilateralism. The two issues are indeed linked. The erosion of multilateralism is one of the major challenges facing the international community. The erosion began before Donald Trump came to power, with the emergence of a post-Soviet world. And it will not stop with Joe Biden coming to power. The idea of state sovereignty is dominant. So-called illiberal democracies are setting the standard. International relations are the preserve of strong men talking among themselves. Yet it would be wrong to signal the end of multilateralism. Forced to open up to the private sector and non-governmental organizations, multilateralism is being transformed and has even achieved several successes. For example, with the Paris Climate Agreement, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, or the Vaccine Alliance. There is no alternative to international cooperation for solving global problems. This makes me confident in the future of the specialized organization that form the bedrock of international Geneva. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, we are transitioning from one world to another. In past centuries, states largely dominated international relations, but today they no longer enjoy this monopoly. From a political point of view, the role of international organizations, as well as that of other actors, has grown in importance. For example, it is impossible to ignore that multinational companies exercise their influence on a global size. And we have to acknowledge that civil society is no longer ready to accept the domination of states in international relations. By taking full advantage of information technology, civil society has gone global. It is no longer content to operate within national borders. It exploits social networks and has acquired sufficient power to shake up governments. The efforts of certain states to control social networks underline the growing importance of transnational civil society. Transitioning from a state that dominates to a state that interacts and cooperates constitutes a major change. It modifies decision-making structures and compels us to design a new global architecture, a more plural vision of governance. We have entered a polycentric world where local, national, regional, and global processes are interlinked. In an interconnected world, states make decisions not only for their own people, but also for others. And this vision gives importance not only to states, but also to local governments, multilateral agencies, transnational actors, business forums, non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, human rights, and advocacy groups. And we need to work in an interdisciplinary and holistic manner. International governance remains fragmented, but we face global challenges and major efforts and institutional innovations are needed to put policy changes into practice, both in national governments and in multinational organizations. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that the effects of international governance are limited. Much of the debate on global governance addresses the international level. In political rhetoric, much emphasis is placed on the importance of international cooperation. But there remains a fundamental need to reform multilateral organizations into global organizations. We have the technology, the knowledge, and the financial means to tackle current global challenges. But to succeed, we have to balance the different interests involved. And this in turn cannot be done without rethinking the foundation of international governance. No higher authority will ask us for proof of today's global challenges, nor will it impose restrictions on us as to how we meet them. Who defines the nature of the risk and problems we are facing? Who is responsible? How can we make sure that everyone benefits from development? Since the Rio conference, some progress have been made in reconciling economy, society, and environment. But no assembly has managed to take the lead and launch the necessary global reorientation. International governance remains fragmented and its effects are limited. At the same time, the following crucial needs persist: a political authority or structure able to set a sustainability agenda at a global level. The need of a transnational democracy at a global level, that means a profound reform of international organizations. A political platform that attracts states, the economy and civil society, not just a forum for debate, but as a place for action. An organization able to mobilize resources and coordinate their use. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, never before has humanity been linked together as strongly in a community of risk and of fate. In our globalized, interdependent world, we have to find ways together towards more sustainability and more justice. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for these enriching insights into multilateralism, governance, and advancing global leadership for the 21st century. I now have the privilege to invite our next renowned speaker, who has also had a distinguished career in politics serving her country. Ms. Vaida Vike Freiberga, you served as the 6th president of Latvia from 1999 to 2007, the first woman to hold this post. Former UN Secretary General, the late Kofi Annan, named you his special envoy on United Nations reform. Today, as a member of and former president of the Club de Madrid and co-chair of the Nizami Gyanjavi International Center, you continue to advocate for the ones left behind, as well as democratic leadership and effective global governance. It is my pleasure to invite you to speak, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I start by congratulations to all who have organized this conference. It seems to me that not just the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations, but the current world situation make it amply clear to everybody that leadership, and particularly global leadership, is very much needed. And at the same time, what we see in the public media, and that is what I'd like to address in these introductory remarks, there's a singular lack of faith in leadership. We see two very contradictory movements. On the one hand, everybody clamors for leadership, and we in this conference are among the most prominent to do so. And by the way, congratulations to the World Academy of Art and Science and its leader, Dr. Gary Jacobs. It was his idea to convince United Nations in Geneva to undertake this year-long program on studying leadership. Leadership is seen in a variety of different ways. Throughout history, it has been, as Madame Calmy-Ray pointed out, a matter of strong men talking to each other and deciding events, or more often than that, strong men fighting each other and their armies to see who could kill more on the other side, occupy territory, acquire resources, acquire power. And today, if we look around in the world among the members of the United Nations, we see a great many countries still where you have a strong leader who either legitimately elected or by changing the constitution has established themselves as a very strong leader at the top of a strong hierarchy, a vertical of power, where decisions are absolutely and without objection taken at the very top. And then the vertical of power lets them filter down, and the orders and the decisions are transmitted to those lower in the hierarchy. Everybody has a place in the hierarchy. They have a certain degree of autonomy. They have a certain amount of degrees of freedom in their actions, but the vertical of power is the most important. Then you have the, if you like, the contrary model, which is that of representative democracy. But in real life, of course, it is not so simple. Never is a vertical of power so fully established and strong that it does not have deviations from the orders from above, except for brief periods such as Stalin's and Lenin's reign of terror, when by absolute brutal terror, or in Nazi Germany, for a brief period, absolute authority from above could be maintained. Representative democracy, on the other hand, delegates leadership responsibilities, both responsibilities and initiatives, by electing its elected representatives. But no later than yesterday, I was reading somebody in the media having an interesting essay about how, in their opinion, representative democracy was not doing the job. The job, in fact, was not being done because representatives that have been gained their positions through elections had lost the trust of the populations, had lost the respect of the media, were not anymore able to do what their constitutions had meant them to do. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an extraordinarily serious complaint to make to representative democracy. Because when we talk about global leadership, when we talk about multilateralism, we are talking about representative democracy on a world scale. And if within any country, even a small country, the citizens cannot accept the very basic principles of what representative democracy is all about, how can we possibly hope to have at the level of the United Nations, at whatever level of global governance, a respect for the decisions taken, a respect for the persons in a position of responsibility, and most of all, respect in the ideas that they represent. And this is where I think it is so important for this particular conference to be co-organized with the World Academy of Art and Science, because we do, in this day and age, rely very heavily on expert opinion. We are deluged by masses of information and by equally vast masses of disinformation. How does the ordinary citizen sift through it? How does the ordinary citizen know whom to choose as their representative, whom to support as a leader of thought or of action? We are faced with a need for understanding, for analysis, for the gathering of facts, for interpretation, for a placing in context. All of that is the privilege of the scientific method. And this is why scientists of all ilk, and not just nuclear scientists and astrophysicists and biochemists, but humanists and philosophers and trained minds in general, are needed to feed into the public domain clear ideas, well-argumented ideas, ideas supported by evidence, ideas verified by contact and checks with reality. At the same time, what we need is a renewed confidence in representative democracy, in the sense that not everybody can do everything. We cannot have just civil society ruling a country. We cannot have representatives of interest groups all by themselves take over government. I know this from my current experience of the Lancet COVID-19 experts group, where I am co-chair of a subgroup about those who have been the most affected by the pandemic. And in our debates, it's very interesting. What we are finding is that somebody who is an expert and who has been working with gender inequality tells us our report should see everything through the lens of gender differences. Somebody else has been working with children, and they will tell you the children are the most vulnerable of all groups possible. They are our future. Without them, we are lost. we should present everything through the lens of children. Then we have those who talk about the refugees and the displaced, and some even remember about the aged who are actually the ones in this particular case hit the most heavily by this pandemic. And what happens? We have to have a common view that brings everybody together. We must have not just a hierarchical, a vertical of responsibility and power, but a matrix, a complex matrix into which we have to feed the different, if you like, silos of information and of need and of necessity, but we cannot allow them to remain silos. They must be interconnected like the neural networks in our brains. Each network is connected to an incredible multiplicity of other networks. So ladies and gentlemen, it is in that perspective of a matrix of needs, of necessities, of ideas presented, tentative ideas to be tested and to implemented, that we should be looking at the world. And it is a system where politicians, elected representatives have their place. And when they are found to be wanting in their inability to face up to reality, in their inability to accept the facts on the ground, in their inability to take significantly proven advice from their advisors, then hopefully, not always, the population will ask for them to be replaced by others. But international, supranational organizations like the United Nations should be open to input from the nation states that have been at the basis of their foundation and their representatives. But thank you very much, United Nations, for all that you have done with all the agencies that you have that try and bring together in a complex and useful matrix all the other branches of society, including civil society, interest groups, those who are definitely left behind, and their possibility to have their voices heard. Thank you very much for what you do. And ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very successful and fruitful conference.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you for your kind words toward the United Nations, a very rare commodity these days. But mostly, especially thank you for your profound observations, which provide an important basis for the forthcoming discussions. I'd now like to turn to Gary Jacobs, President and CEO of the World Academy, and our esteemed co-host. Besides his titles, the best way to describe Gary is through his work. I'm only slightly exaggerating when I say that Gary himself is an embodiment of a leader in the 21st century. In his work, he is focusing on new paradigms and strategies in fields as diverse as governance, economy, business, education, international security, etc. Gary, it's my pleasure to invite you to speak. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. And my thanks to the Director General and to all your colleagues at the UNOG for making this such a meaningful and enjoyable experience. I've come to get great admiration for the dedication of the team in Geneva and a much greater appreciation of the challenges that you faced in negotiating not only the complexities of the world, but the many stakeholders and masters and owners and claimants to the work of the United Nations. I'd like to speak just very briefly about the context in which this project is taking place and what we hope to get out of it. It's hard to even remember back to the end of the Cold War now and how exhilarated and exuberant we were in hopes of nuclear disarmament and world trade, the founding of the internet, the growth of regional governance, especially in Europe. And then of course, we had our problems, but still the future in the 21st century looked to be something very much looking forward to. And then following 2008, we seem to have hit a bump and a curve and seem to have been going in the other direction. And already several of the speakers have alluded to where we seem to be heading from an actual retreat from much of the progress that we've been making, a retreat from democracy to autocracy, a retreat from our principles of global free trade, from regional cooperation. We still got Brexit right on the agenda. A loss of faith in our institutions at all levels, both at the international level, at the national level, our media, even the credibility of science. And all of this leading to the idea that even after the remarkable decision in 2015 to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, to try to take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and embody it in actual implementation and achieve it, we seem to be going in the other direction. And that led us to, in our discussions, lengthy discussions and partnership with the UN, to come up with this proposal on the principle that in spite of the difficulties and not minimizing the opposition and the resistance to them, that there must be something we can do that will energize progress and move us beyond the limitation, the barriers, and the obstructions that are in the way. And that's what we coined this phrase, catalytic strategies. Catalytic strategies that would not solve all our problems at once, would not be comprehensive solutions, but would show us with the right type of leadership, not just leadership of people, but leadership of organizations and leadership of ideas and leadership of the right types of systems and measures and movements and networks, that we could in fact find the way to lead ourselves forward during this period. And then the pandemic came, and as if we didn't have enough on our agenda before then. And strangely, we conducted a meeting 6 months ago of about 300 experts online with UNOG. And it was strange that in spite of being right in the middle of this very difficult times, how much hope there was that the pandemic also demonstrated to us that if we wanted to change, we really could change. If we wanted to make a breakthrough in areas that we found it very difficult, whether it's in education or in healthcare priorities or even in global finance, that we could do something that we hadn't been able to do for decades or even more. And this is the premise from which we start. What we are going to discuss during this conference, we're not going to attempt to deal with all of the issues or all of the solutions that are necessary. What we are going to try to do what we are going to try to do is to point out that there really are things we can do to move ahead. In the conference, we're going to have 10 sessions focusing on critical issues. We're going to look at the problems of food security, which have been magnified tremendously by the pandemic and rightly drawing attention to the phenomenal work of World Food Program in addressing critical food conditions and hunger conditions. We're going to look at the rising problem of unemployment, which by projections is likely to get much worse before it gets better. We're going to look at the problem of climate change and the need for a planetary plan to really push us through because we're far behind the targets that we were planning on. We're going to look at the problem of education, especially the higher education, because all the projections are that we're getting further and further behind in our goals of trying to provide quality education to all who seek it and all who need it. And the pandemic has only aggravated those problems by closing down our schools over the world, all over the world. We're going to look at the issue of finance and how much money we really need to implement these SDGs and all of the problems we have, but what's going on, the positive changes that are going on, and the opportunities both for public finance and private finance that can really make a difference. And you're going to hear some very encouraging research that's being done and trends that are unfolding. We're going to look at the critical challenge that we have in implementing the SDGs of how do we go from formulation of goals and ideas to effective policies and strategies and implementation. How do we close the gap between the research and the action, or between the different disciplines, each looking at the problem from a different perspective? We're going to look at some interesting ideas on how we could build trust, greater trust in the multilateral system, and trust in the media, especially the press, which, as we have seen recently, is so critical one way or the other to the functioning of democratic societies. And very importantly, we're going to look at the role of youth and youth networks, and how can we mobilize the voice of global society, we the people? How can we, rather than going only through our national governments, which we know are not that representative a lot of the time, how can we get a direct voice for global society in making real change to our multilateral system? And all of this under an umbrella of looking at not one or other independent areas, but looking, all of these are aspects of human security. And the UN 75 report, which the Director General mentioned, one of the voices was clear. The people are interested not just in national security, they're interested in all these dimensions of security, and we've got to find an integrated way of conceptualizing and acting on them together. We're here not with all the solutions. We're here with some what we think are very valuable ideas, proposals that have come not just from the Academy and from UNOG, but about 70 different partner organizations who have been involved in this partnership, for which we're very grateful, to whom we're very grateful. And what we've come here before is not to pronounce the answers, but to debate, to discuss, to project possibilities and hear from a group of wonderful experts. And then we will go back and formulate again from what we've heard, have some further meetings, and finally come back with final recommendations of the project. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, David, for your gracious hosting. We look forward to the program.
Thank you very much, Gary Jacobs, President Vicky Freiberger, President Calmire, and Director General Valavaya, for this excellent setting of the tone for the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now start with the thematic tracks of the conference in accordance with the program that you all have. The moderators of the various thematic panels that follow have no less of a daunting task than me, perhaps even more so, in managing the time and ensuring the richest possible debate in the limited time allotted for each panel, which I certainly failed to do since we have run over our time. I wish you all fruitful discussions and invite the moderator of the first session on human security and peace building, Mr. Jonathan Granoff, to take over. Thank you very much.
It is my honor to chair this first opening panel. My name is Jonathan Granoff. I'm a fellow in the World Academy of Arts and Sciences, president of the Global Security Institute, and a representative to the United Nations of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates. Leadership is the issue of the day, and leadership requires ideas commensurate with the challenges of the moment. In the present circumstances, the Secretary General of the United Nations addressed the General Assembly pursuant to a resolution highlighting the importance of human security. In 2013, he presented a comprehensive report on human security that highlighted human security as the interlocking principle of the three pillars of the United Nations system: human rights, peace and security, and development. In short, the report emphasized that human security comprehends in principle the right of all people to live in freedom and dignity, free from poverty and despair. All individuals, in particular vulnerable people, are entitled to freedom from fear and freedom from want, with an equal opportunity to enjoy all their rights and fully develop their human potential. That vision is what our duty is to put into practice. The report gives practical examples of successes and recommendations, which include the Secretary General promoting the mainstreaming of human security into all the activities of the United Nations system, considering human security as an overarching framework in the post-2015 development agenda known as the Sustainable Development Goals. That the member states of the United Nations give financial support to the very valuable work of the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security, and that the Secretary General report every 2 years on progress in this agenda. From personal health to geopolitics, a human security approach does not diminish the value of other levels of governance, whether local or national. Working in a cooperative fashion to govern global concerns that impact the daily lives of everyone does not diminish national sovereignty. In fact, it is the only way for the first duty of the state to protect its citizens that can be fulfilled. Multilateral cooperation is the only way to fulfill the first duty of every nation. In fact, multinationalism, in a sense, is the mantra of human security. There must be a realistic proportionality that also recognizes that many challenges today, such as pandemics, protecting the climate, protecting the health of the oceans, cannot be addressed with a disproportionate emphasis on militarism and nationalism, but require global cooperation. A small portion of the enormous economic allocations for militaries focused policies would be far better spent addressing the imperative to identify, affirm, and pursue our common interests and effectively achieve the cooperation in the political climate necessary to protect the natural world's climate, the health of the oceans, and the common good of public health. Pursuing security through threatening human annihilation is not as efficient, practical, or morally compelling as working cooperatively to achieve a sustainable and better quality of life for everyone. This should be self-evident. And I believe if the people of the world understood the integrated human security agenda, they would clamor to support it. This change to a human security approach will involve resource allocations to achieve the SDGs rather than enormous resource allocations to modernize and improve nuclear weapons. Today and tomorrow, we will be hearing from experts in numerous disciplines, and I suggest that implicit in all of them is a human security agenda. Whether we realize it or not, the human body functions in an integrated fashion where the health of the lungs is not separate from the health of the heart or the liver. Likewise, local, national, and global health are part of an integrated whole in today's world. The human security approach will not only enhance cooperation amongst nations, it will provide far more security within nations by addressing disrupting threats and freeing up intellectual, organizational, and economic resources needed to address real daily life human needs. This integral and comprehensive approach to security is capable of galvanizing the best of our humanity. It is both morally coherent, practically viable, and it is uplifting and inspiring rather than fear-driven. It has the possibility to galvanize public support, but it requires leadership. It requires leadership. We need leaders that realize that our planet is an integrated living system, that humanity is one species of life in a web of life, and that every single person is precious. Humanity is not a fragmented phenomena. We are social creatures, and in today's borderless world, we need leaders with borderless hearts. This is not a new call. This is a perennial call of wisdom. And I'll end by quoting a wise 13th century Persian poet, Sadi, who said, "Humanity is as one body. An injury to any part causes a healing response from the whole. O you who cannot feel the suffering of others, can you call yourselves truly human? The human security agenda invokes our highest human qualities, compassion, caring, and service to others, and it requires leaders with that wisdom. I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, whose life's work has been an embodiment of bringing these principles into practice. Ambassador and Mr. Yukayo Takusi of Japan is presently the special advisor to the Secretary General and has been on the subject of human security since 2010. He has been both a public global servant, serving as the Assistant Secretary General and Controller of the United Nations, as well as having been the permanent representative of the nation of Japan to the United Nations. I just want to say that each of our speakers' bios, which are far more extensive than I want to spend our time, is in our literature package. And I am honored to turn the floor over to Ambassador Takusi. Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Granov, for your kind introduction and also strong support to human security. As advocate of human security for over more than 20 years, the first 10 years I was advocating human security, promoting from the representative of the Japanese government, which has been instrumental to make it a global operational concept. For the last 10 years, I have been representing Secretary General, UN, to advocate this concept. So I'm delighted to participate in this conference. And first of all, I'd like to thank UN office in Geneva, but also World Academy or Academy of Arts and Science for this initiative, and particularly inviting me to speak about human security approach to peace building, because this is a session of human security and peace building, I understand. In considering peace building, the interdependence of three pillars of UN activities, namely peace, development, human rights, cannot be overemphasized. As already Mr. Granov, you mentioned, alluded, the report of Secretary General that I was responsible for preparing earlier to General Assembly. Obviously, durable and sustainable peace cannot be realized until economic activities are reactivated and daily livelihood for the people improved, and human rights are protected and minorities are also respected. These are challenges of peace building. Also, durable economic and social development cannot be realized until stable political and social order and predictability based on rule of law and sustainability of environment are assured. On the other hand, human rights and freedom are often breached when sustaining peace and development is not achieved. So where human rights are not respected and inclusive development not progressing, development cannot be sustainable for long term. So this way, peace, development, and human rights need to be pursued in parallel to achieve a peaceful, inclusive, and prosperous society. Such interconnected hardcore nexus is increasingly recognized, emphasized in UN, and integrated approach is called for. Emphasis on prevention and comprehensive approach to peace building is based on this recognition that ceasefire agreement could be elusive without further effort in economic and human rights fronts. So another fight will break out in a few years' time. This is repeated in many places, the failure of peace building. And Agenda 2030 with its Sustainable Development Goals is another important initiative founded on same recognition that peace and development human rights must be pursued in parallel to realize sustainable development. So you cannot separate. However, fact is that given separate legislative bases, United Nations consists of many organs, entities, and offices that do their own work in the three pillars of activities. It's always challenging. I have spent so many years in UN system, in and out, to UN to work together, coordinate separate entities, transcending silos, such as security development divide, or humanitarian development divide, to divide collaborative effort together for joint purpose. So in my view, human security conference is extremely useful to unite this effort because it places people always at the center. This is a concept that provides a cross-sectoral, conceptual and programmatic thread overarching activities in peace and development and human rights. So in my view, a human security approach will always provide variable framework for UN entities, first of all, to work together for addressing interconnected challenges for peace building, but not only that, but SDGs, eliminate climate changes and disaster prevention and others. In my view, major contribution of human security is that it helped paradigm change in concept of security. First, vertically, and second, horizontally. Vertically, human security extends our understanding of security beyond the state toward people. It looks at the individual not as a part of aggregate group, country, or government. It aims at protecting and empowering every individual to develop the ability to protect the extent possible. Thus, focus will be on the most vulnerable people so that no one will be left behind. Horizontally, this new paradigm recognized the importance of multiplicity of factors that were previously peripheral to national security and are threatening people's safety and survival, like pandemic, climate change, infectious diseases. These are center of security now threat. So it's underlined today's challenges are complex, multidimensional, and interrelated. Thus, human security enables a comprehensive approach and provide platform. I mentioned about partnership of UN system, but also partnership of stakeholders in private sector. This is the essence, I think, of this conference. Today, we can say that we have accumulated lesson learned for past 20 years, more than 20 years, for application by human security within UN, but also beyond UN. This concept is very much broadly supported, more strongly, I think, outside UN system, frankly speaking. That has contributed new way of thinking and responding complex challenges. In particular, I mentioned human security emphasis on context specific to meet needs of people is most relevant in peace building and sustainable peace because it helps examining and addressing root causes of conflict. Every conflict has a particular context and origin. So peace building will never succeed unless addressing to resolve root causes in a comprehensive manner. And human security approach to put always people at center is very useful. We have now crisis of COVID-19. It is a stark reminder that once black elephant, like unprepared pandemic hits, it will spread so quickly and so widely, causing irreparable damages on health and economy, but also every aspect of society. And however strong and however rich, no country alone can protect population effectively. So COVID-19 is causing, as you mentioned, disproportionately serious damage on the most vulnerable people, children, women, elderly, and people on move. And also distrust in institutional governance is growing at all levels. So facing such a global crisis, I think significance of human security approach focusing on most vulnerable people could not be clearer. So considering intersection of these growing risks, we have climate emergency, human mobility, transnational crimes, digitalization, multilateralism based on global solidarity is more essential than ever before, as in opening session emphasized. But multilateralism often means cooperation for collective action among governments, along the UN. But it is more than that. Global challenge cannot be solved by UN or government alone. As you can see, climate change is one example. Pandemic is one example. We need multilateralism that goes beyond government, public sector. We need cooperation by business, civil society, and academia, because they possess knowledge, they possess expertise and human resources. So we need to develop solutions through partnership, going beyond the government, beyond the UN system that realize tangible improvement in safety, livelihood, and opportunities, and most important, dignity. This is the essence of dignity of people, vulnerable people. So in conclusion, I would say this is where human security can bring great value in helping forge a path forward to build back a better world. I believe now is the time to ensure the advancement of human security is central to the achievement of security in various levels, national level, regional level, international level in this century. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Ambassador, thank you very much. And I want to highlight the outstanding report. I didn't realize you had that you had leaned in on that. And I'm going to post in our chat where it's available. It is document A/68685, which was essentially a follow-up on a General Assembly resolution calling on the Secretariat to provide such a report. It is not only comprehensive in addressing the principles of human security, but it's replete with examples of success and represents an enormous amount of very valuable research, and makes the case that that from the local to the global level, a human security paradigm is both morally compelling and practically possible. Otherwise, we face ongoing crises, one after another, and this is a perfect introduction to Ambassador Christian Duce, who is the director of the Geneva Center for Security, because his background is in crisis management. He has enormous experience in addressing the attendant crises that arise from inadequate addressing to the underlying problems that human security seeks to address. Ambassador Duce, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, global leadership in the new or next normal is not about fighting the problems. It's about together creating the solutions. Only together can we meet the exceptional and even daunting challenges that the world, humanity, and the planet are facing today as we speak. Let me start by congratulating the Office of the United Nations to Geneva, the World Academy of Arts and Science, and all the partner organizations, leading scientists, and extraordinary and committed individuals who have contributed to develop this timely report on what type of global or draft report yet on what types of global leadership is required in the 21st century. The draft report is thoughtful and insightful. It's visionary. Hard-hitting analysis and initial findings are both constructive and often very practical, actionable in its recommendations. So congratulations. The very process of this initiative is itself an excellent example of what effective and impactful global leadership in the 21st century requires. The draft report clearly articulates what urgently needs to be done in a range of areas: the need to redefine multilateralism, to strengthen the sustaining peace agenda and human security, to mobilize civil society, to generate new finance, to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and finally, to transform global education. I would like to comment on two angles from the draft report. First, as it relates to human security and peace building, and then second, building on the first point, how to operationalize the substantive findings of the report. That is, what type of human leadership is required to make the recommendation happen and sustaining peace possible. Because peace is about people. People make peace happen. As individuals, but even more effectively as individuals part of an inclusive, representative, empowered, and committed collective. So first, I noted the suggestion that it is time to debunk 3 myths. That security in the 21st century relies only on military power. That there is supposedly a shortage of money in the world. And finally, that we are trapped in scarcity thinking, when in fact, there is, as the draft report points out, an abundance of most things in the world. The problem lies in how we are conceptualizing, prioritizing, organizing, and dividing issues and responses. Building peace, positive peace, should be everybody's business. As the reports point out, effective problem solving requires a much broader and more representative set of institutions, organizations, networks, and individuals. Future leadership is about recognizing the human potential in the human security context and give individuals powers and tools to create solutions for the new or next normal. The new leader is someone who is compassionate and understands that the solution can come from anywhere and anyone. To strengthen the human security and to build peace, to effectively lead in the 21st century, there needs to be a change of mindset. As defined in the document, leading needs to include a much broader mosaic of stakeholders at multiple levels, states, but also societies, communities, and even individuals around the world. We can choose whether to see it as a threat and liability, or together treat it as an asset and figure it out and nurture how best to make every person's experience, insight, and best ideas count. Leadership in the 21st century is indeed truly global. Everybody could and should count. That is at the heart of human security. Every human being needs protection, and best way to achieve this is through empowerment. We live in a highly interconnected world, marked by ongoing and far-reaching transformations. Change are occurring both gradually and abruptly, on different levels and multiple spheres. Today's security challenges are manifold with intricate, interwoven, and interdependent patterns. Dealing with ambiguities and dilemmas, learning from failures, managing complexity in international security policy and peace. All these challenges require critical thinking, imagination, innovative problem-solving skills, and a solid knowledge of today's multi-layered security environment. Heads of international organizations, NGOs, and foundations like the Geneva Center for Security Policy also have special obligations. Changes start with us. We have to practice what we say or teach. We have to lead by example, embrace the challenges, experiment, test, fail, and learn. Chart out a way to navigate the very complex environment. Innovate, do so in an inclusive manner, and be guided by empathy with the other, the less fortunate. We have to build a range of skills and attitude in our organizations, which have become essential fact for actors working in the field and the service of peace and security. First, to develop the need to develop our own and our organization's capacity for anticipation and adaptation. Second, the need to increase our sense of imagination, our creativity skills and curiosity. Third, the need to develop our personal resilience and the resilience of our organizations. And fourth, finally, to cultivate both individual and organizational learning agility. An agility that serves as the foundation for all the previous points. Too often, I hear that people are too busy to learn, and this is dangerous. We risk missing opportunities, neglecting preparation, making blunders. Most of us have a smartphone, and if we don't update its software, we will run into trouble, right? Such as security gaps and so on. So what do? We update our phones. But when was the last time that we updated our most important software, our brain, with the skills, the tools, and the appropriate attitude? COVID-19 has had a tremendous negative impact around the world, but it has also brought an almost unprecedented opportunity to think anew, to reflect, and to reprioritize. As I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, global leadership in the new or next normal is not about fighting the problems. It is about together creating the solutions. Only together can we meet the exceptional and even daunting challenges that the world, humanity, and the planet are facing today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I was particularly struck by your call for personal responsibility, as well as the fact that we update our technologies to meet our market demands. And we've hardly updated our definition of security commensurate with the actual threats that we face. I was reflecting that 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton, a single cell organism in the oceans. And yet we don't have any major civil society or adequate government response to protecting our very breath of life that every human being needs. When the security model of the nation state was created, arising from the treaties of Westphalia, which was designed to stop the carnage in Europe over the definition of whose idea of Jesus' love was best, where Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other, we have really not updated our perspective appropriate to our technological impact on the natural world. So we're not protecting the oceans. We're not adequately protecting the climate. And I would say it's largely because we haven't updated our notion of security, that we haven't recognized that every other breath comes from the oceans. And the human security agenda addresses this holistic approach. It is exactly the idea needed to take us from a horse and buggy era of security concepts to the technologies appropriate to the modern world, the technologies of ideas that are appropriate. And one of these ideas that didn't exist when the treaties of Westphalia were created, but that we've since discovered is essential for good governance and the flourishing of human beings and society, is not just the application of the scientific method, but the application of fundamental human rights, that we have to understand the natural world and our duty to harmonize with the natural world based on hard science, but we have to harmonize amongst people on a daily life basis and internationally between nations. And nothing is more basic to that than human rights. So I'm very pleased now to introduce Elizabeth Tishy-Fisselberger, who is the ambassador of Austria to the United Nations office in Geneva, and she is the current president of the Human Rights Council. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, which at a time when most people's minds are on the corona crisis, makes us take a step back and think of the bigger picture. What kind of leadership do we need in the 21st century? And what is the essence of human security? With COVID and other crises, our world looks rather fragile. Critics of multilateralism have there been quick in putting all the blame on the failure of the multilateral system and the international governments, and some of them call for a return to national leadership. Let us think twice whether that sounds convincing. President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, who, as you may remember, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 for the part he played in the peace process of his country, came to Geneva recently and said, among other things, if you want peace, you have to cultivate social justice. That does not sound so different from what President Roosevelt said in 1941 when he first started thinking about the United Nations. And he said there is no real freedom without economic security and independence. Human beings who are slaves of their needs are not free. Those who are hungry or have no jobs are the stuff dictatorships are made of. I guess Since 1994, we have started to call this concept human security. And it is defined by 7 dimensions: economic security, food security, health, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. Peace is more than the absence of war. And security is a lot more than what the army and the police do. According to a study by the World Bank, the main source of conflicts is exclusion. And other studies have proved that societies that uphold human rights are more resilient, more sustainable, and more secure. I have the privilege, as you said, of presiding over the Human Rights Council this year, a body where we come across the nexus between human rights and peace and security all the time. And we see that the international community did all the right things in setting standards on human rights, the rule of law, and accountability. This brought about not only economic prosperity unheard of in previous years, but also social peace. In Europe, the creation of the European Union was based on the very idea that making war materially impossible by intertwining the economies would bring not only lasting peace, but also unprecedented prosperity. And that was on a continent which had spent the last 2000 years fighting wars about borders, and it worked. Regardless of these success stories, we witness a kind of erosion of the trust in the multilateral processes. Very often this is a mistrust about what people call the elites, very often politicians, experts, scientists, sometimes the media, generally speaking, those who are perceived as being far away and suspected of not understanding the ordinary citizen. This erosion could be linked to what the World Health Organization has started to call an infodemic, an excessive information which, however, confuses and antagonizes people to the extent that they become easy prey to misinformation and rumors. One of the biggest challenges for the multilateral system in any case is to prove in how far it does make a difference to people's lives. There is a strange contrast between the increasingly higher standards which we are setting on all kinds of topics and the growing pushback against those standards on the ground, at least in some parts of the world. Roberto Saviano is an Italian author who became famous because he writes about organized crime to the extent that he has to live under police protection all around the clock. He developed what he calls the Kalashnikov index. And he says that just like there is a McDonald index, which tells us about the state of development in a country, there is a Kalashnikov index, which tells about the state of human rights. The cheaper the Kalashnikov, the less human rights. The human rights violations of today are, however, possibly the armed conflicts of tomorrow. This is why standards set by multilateral institutions such as the Human Rights Council, which intend to tangibly improve people's lives, are so important. And let me mention 3 examples among the so-called emerging subjects where I think that human rights-based approach would make all the difference. New technologies, climate change, and disarmament. Recent developments in new technologies have great promises for solving the problems and the biggest challenges of this world. But they also have the potential of becoming instruments for violating human rights, for example, by exercising control over people. Industry does not fancy standards. They thrive in the unregulated space around them. This is why the international community has to define some red lines. One example of doing this is the European Union 2018 Data Protection Regulation, the toughest privacy law in the world, which can cause harsh fines in the case of infringements. And even though it applies only to data related to people living in Europe, because of the wide outreach of the European market, that also puts pressure on companies worldwide. Another example, as I said, is climate change. The global climate emergency is perhaps the most profound planet-wide threat to our world ever since World War II. It impacts the right to life, to health, to food, to water, to shelter, to non-discrimination, to development, and to self-determination. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, recently pointed out that 40% of civil wars over the last 6 decades were linked to environmental degradation, 40%. And the Special Rapporteur of the UN advocates for an individual right to a healthy environment. This is a very difficult discussion among states. And of course, it includes the equally difficult discussion about what to do about the vaccines and the treatments, which we'll hopefully soon have for the corona pandemic, how to use them in a non-discriminatory and human rights oriented way. These discussions will not go away for a long time. My third example is disarmament. There used to be a Cold War, post-Cold War consensus that weapons of mass destruction needed to be contained. Yet that consensus is eroding. We are confronted with a new generation of weapons which raise human rights concerns unheard of not long ago. Just think of drones or other autonomous weapons which cannot even distinguish between a school bus and a tank, or a soldier and a child. It is not very popular with powerful states, nor with the industry, to think about these problems. But the UN Human Rights Committee, a body established by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, made it very clear in 2018 that nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, which are indiscriminate in effect and of a nature to cause destruction of human life on a catastrophic scale, are incompatible with the right to life. Against this background, disarmament treaties should be seen above all as a means to avoid the humanitarian consequences of weapons of mass destruction. My country was among the first and the fiercest advocates of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, with the main argument that the possession of nuclear weapons by a small number of countries meant unjustifiable risks for all the others. Granted, the existing multilateral structures could do with some reforms and need some brush up, but that doesn't mean that they have failed. On the contrary, today we see rather clearly that even the most powerful nation states cannot get a grip on climate change on their own, not on new technologies, and not on pandemics. Multilateralism is all about finding common ground to make the system work for the challenges of our time. That is not always a rewarding task. It can be very slow, it can be very cumbersome, but there is no real alternative. Here in Switzerland, we are told the story of General Dufour, who was a Swiss general in the middle of a civil war in the 19th century, and said after that, "I want to gain the peace." He understood that peace does not materialize by itself. And that finding hasn't changed in the last 150 years. This is where human security and peace building come in. The international legal texts on human rights reflect the basic idea that all men are equal in dignity and rights. Upholding that conviction is a lot more than a job for human rights defenders and activists. It is an investment into our societies and an insurance for our societies with a view to the future. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much. And thank you for highlighting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the importance of the rule of law. I just want to underscore that the International Court of Justice unanimously ruled that there is a duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons, and that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has within it the commitment of the nuclear weapon states to negotiate the elimination of those weapons. And nothing could be more basic than an international order of multilateralism than living up to legal obligations and living up to promises. Pacta sunt servanda, promises must be kept, is the very basic principle of all civilized conduct. And there is indeed an existing duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. And I want to just say thank you for the leadership that your country, Austria, has taken in advancing these principles. And congratulations, the treaty will enter into force at the very beginning of the coming year. I now have the privilege of introducing Professor Funmi, and please forgive me if I don't pronounce your last name correctly, Olanisek Olanisakin. Please forgive me for that. She is both a scholar and a very practical advocate for everything we've been talking about. She's a founding member of the African Leadership Center and is presently a professor at King's College. Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Listen, let me start by thanking the organizers of this conference and acknowledging the excellent work and outputs that are emerging from the project already. I want to believe that they will continue to flow out of the underpinning project for some time to come. What I want to do here is to very briefly offer a combination of conceptual, policy, and global leadership practice to help transform, if you like, the still relevant ideals of human security. At the start of my own senior scholarship, this was something that I embraced a great deal, and I have deeply researched, but it seems as if there's a conundrum to be resolved somewhat, because we see a cyclical pattern in which we have not managed to transform the multilateral space. So I want to offer a combination of that conceptual, the policy, and global leadership practice that can help us transform this very relevant conversation. On the question of concept, much has been said about leadership and the vital importance of effective leadership that does not, on the one hand, silo one issue, but also is able to look at common agendas. We've heard that already from our speakers this morning, including in the introductory panel. I argue for simultaneous attention to governing life in common by focusing on what secures our collective aspirations to live well, live long, and to live in dignity, which is actually what are the key elements of the human security concept and agenda. Will boil down to in very practical ways. If you asked a whole group of people, students in my classroom, every year when you poll them, this is what their own notion of security for people really means. So focusing simultaneously, for example, on these elements means not privileging some issues over others, some groups as well over others. And we cannot secure, for example, one's right to food today, and also they, wait till tomorrow to secure their freedom from sexual violence, for example, and then the day after to secure the environment in which they have to live and thrive. I mean, I think that's the bottom line of taking an intersectional approach, if you like, to this whole notion of human security in terms of how we can practicalize it. But making this a reality, of course, requires no less than the transformation of the global leadership infrastructure and disrupting the very multilateral system as we know it for the better. That disruption has to look at the system for the better. So far, we have seen a multilateral order, but in fact also within the so-called states, where that engage in that multilateral system, for example. We have seen so much focus on the hardware of the leadership infrastructure, the systems, the institutions in which leadership is therefore performed, along with the technicalities of governance. And I think several speakers have alluded to this already. That's where we need to seek transformation, because so far there's been a limited focus on the relationships, hopefully relationships of trust between the managers of the hardware. And this is the software of the leadership infrastructure. We've seen little focus on the relationships between those who manage the space of our hardwares, whether it's a court system, whether it's, if you like, security system, whatever it is that is supposed to ensure human security, to guarantee it at the global level, whether it's a lot of the agencies that we work in, there's little relationship between the guardians of those spaces and the very people who live through peace, war, hunger, climate change, or wealth and prosperity, or if you like, disease and processes of rapid change. That is what is disconnected. And peace building, therefore, requires a recentering on both the local and global society's conversation with our governing elite, with the managers of the hardware, of that leadership infrastructure. It will require no less than a rethinking of power and influence. And in particular, we need to really consider a diffusion of power. I know that really sounds too scholarly. Sometimes, it seems like it's impracticable, but it's not just a scholarly thing to think about power, the distribution of power. It's the reality of the world we live in. We need to acknowledge that those powers reside in particular places and not others. So what does diffusion look like? It requires distributed leadership be brought to the fore. It requires that we look at other bases of power outside of the space of the state, outside of national positional power, including voices and exercise of agency by the usually excluded silent majority about the collective aspirations to live well, to live long and in dignity. We have close to 2 billion people like this in the world, and they cannot be excluded, as our previous speaker rightly said, about exclusion being at the core of what makes peace fail at the end of the day. It has to be expressed in the daily realities of multilateral actors in addressing what matters today for humanity. And therefore, what matters today for humanity, which is this pandemic at this moment. We are seeing a test of effective global leadership in today's pandemic. We've already said in this forum and in other fora that we live in a truly interconnected world, and the pandemic has shown that. And the report that we discussed here today has really, really elevated that to the fore. We only have to see the pattern already. We're seeing a rush to secure a vaccine through bilateral agreements, which is very much a retreat to the old way of doing things. Today, we can begin to transform that global leadership infrastructure. If the most influential actors in the multilateral space truly observe the conversations and relationships between people and the governing elite, they will bring the difficult conversations to the fore of global attention. And if they did, question is, whose voice will they privilege? And this is the conundrum that the global leadership infrastructure must resolve today. We need to get real about applying those concepts. It means that we have to disrupt the multilateral arrangements as they stand, but disrupt them for the better in terms of who's allowed, whose voices are allowed in that space. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for reminding us of the principle that we have to apply justice, really. That's behind justice and caring to whatever agenda we go forward with, or otherwise we can't possibly succeed. I want to apologize to people who've come in expecting the normal translation capacity. The UN office in Geneva has done a marvelous job in facilitating and working for this conference, but because of the COVID crisis, some of the capacities are somewhat limited, and we've been unable to have the translations. But I want to assure everyone listening the extraordinary hard work of the UNOG in making this happen. And I guess I didn't thank the World Academy of Arts and Sciences enough because I feel part of it, but I want to particularly take this moment to express my gratitude, especially to Gary Jacobs for his leadership in making this happen. And another little housekeeping, Martin Griffith, he really brings to the fore his absence. He can't be here because he is the special envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for the crisis in Yemen. And if there ever was an example of the integration of all these issues and how it affects people's human security, we can see it in Yemen. Here's a geopolitical logjam in stopping this war, and it affects people on the ground, and it's a cycle of violence, and it's the common people that are hurt the worst. And if we had a global human security agenda, it would be a very different world. Our closing speaker, Ambassador Tibor Toth, was the ambassador and permanent representative of Hungary to the United Nations. But I know him as someone who's done an enormous amount. I've observed over decades his enormous contribution to human security and global security. He was instrumental in bringing us the Biological Weapons Convention, and he chaired the negotiations for that treaty. He was instrumental in bringing us the Chemical Weapons Convention, banning chemical weapons, banning biological weapons. And he was and is presently the Executive Secretary Emeritus for the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, where he was the executive director and created the over 300 monitoring stations over the whole planet, not only monitoring whether there's nuclear testing, but also whether there's earthquakes or tsunamis and the health of the whole planet. So his career is just an example of service to global human security. Ambassador Tibor Toth, please, you will be our closing speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much
Excuse me, can I
for this opportunity.
Hello.
Tibor, you're sideways.
May I start with saying that...
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, I will try to adjust. May I start with saying that the issue of leadership is bringing me to the question of transition leadership. And my feeling is that we have to more clearly look into the eyes of the problem or problems we are facing. The continued and renewed implementation of defining arrangements like the Paris Climate Agreement, like the SDGs from the nuclear area with which I'm more familiar, like the implementation of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the strengthening, or the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty is not enough. These are needed steps forward, but it's not enough in itself. My feeling is that we might be sleepwalking with the unimplemented agenda and miss the need for a transition requirement, leadership. This time is different from the point of view of the challenges which are hitting us. We are facing a transition requirement which we haven't seen not just in decades, but for 3 or 4 generations. It's not just a crisis of the coronavirus, be it a public health or an economic challenge. And it's not just a combination of the 2008 financial economic crisis or the 2000 or the mid-1990s and the combination of that. It's a crisis of plural, which is cutting deep because of the unemployment, because of the generational aspects, because of the existential impact, because of what more recently we are seeing in developed OECD countries as well, because of the hunger and fear as a phenomenon coming back to even to these societies. And because of the moral crisis, not just at the individual, but at the collective level. And I'm sorry to say, but there is no quick recovery. As for these crisis elements, it's not just we are coming out with a V-shaped recovery from a financial meltdown. These are staying with us as for their impacts for generation. I would call a combination of this crisis in plural as an emerging super bubble, ready to be burst, with consequences which we do not grasp as it stands now. In addition, and underlying to these elements I mentioned, there is a new economy versus the old economy transition. The industries, the new industries like the Teslas, the new services like Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Google and so on, versus the old industry and old services with different interests and values and what is more important, beneficiaries at the individual level, and beneficiaries as countries or a coalition of countries. So when I say this time is different in a more negative way, it means that it's not just the old Cold War and deterrence type of problems. It's not just the old player frictions like between the United States or the Russian Federation. And it's not just even the new ascendants who are challenging the existing players. We are speaking, in addition to these elements, about tensions within the societies. Some are referring to them as Cold Civil War phenomena within societies. And historically, when this mix happened, and again, these transitions happened probably 3-4 generations ago, somewhere in the 1890s and 1900s, then unfortunately, as a lack of transition leadership, collectively, we ended up with a mix of civil wars, revolutions, and major wars. So this is the unfortunate challenge cut out for us right now to make sure that one by one, we manage these crisis elements and we prevent this super bubble to burst. What we can do, number one, the cyclical phenomena in a situation like that historically was to remove and disintegrate the existing institutions. We cannot repeat what in the 1930s has been done to the League of Nations in Geneva. So we have to be counter-cyclical. We have to preserve the existing global multilateral arrangements and their leadership role. It will not be easy, it will be tough. We have to preserve the SDGs, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, nuclear disarmament, but we have to be ready that walking that path will be more difficult because in a situation where we are, it's counter-cyclical to invest more in those areas. And the last point is we need a transition leadership, recognizing that what we have been doing, the implementation of the unimplemented agenda is not enough. So we have not just leadership in action, but a new leadership of thought for transition leadership. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much. We will hear over the next 2 days a variety of experts addressing the full scope of human challenges from health to education to employment, but implicit in all of them is the importance of an integrated human security agenda. This is if you think of the current approach to security, the extraordinary allocations of money for nuclear weapons, the extraordinary expenses for the conventional armed forces, and the failure of appropriate allocations to protect our planet home and the billions of human lives on it. We must have a change. We must focus security on people. We must come to realize what science has told us. The way in which we are impacting the natural world is unsustainable. And the way in which we're attempting to provide security with weapons of mass destruction, which by accident, design, or madness could end human endeavor in an afternoon, is similarly unsustainable. We have the technology, we have the knowledge, we have the moral calling. It's time for all of us to raise our voices for the change. And as Ambassador Dussey pointed out, we ourselves have to be that change. I boil it down to love people and use things. Don't love things and use people. Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this UNOG, and the World Academy of Arts and Sciences.
Hello, everybody. My name is Phoebe Kunduri, and I will be moderating the economy and employment session. I am particularly happy and honored to chair this session. First of all, I want to thank the World Academy of Art and Science and the United Nations Office at Geneva for this honorary invitation. And most importantly, I want to deeply thank our esteemed panelists for accepting to contribute to this panel. Today, we will be talking, let me open can you see me? Yes. Today, we will be talking with the Director of the Employment Policy Department of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Lee. We will also be talking with Associate Professor of Economics, Professor Pavlina Cherneva. She's Associate Professor at Bard College and a research scholar at the Levy Economics Institute in New York. We are also joined by Ms. Olga Algayerova. Apologies about my pronunciation. She's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And finally, we are joined with Mr. Ume Badia, who is Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva. As I said before, this session is focused on the economy and the employment, and I would like to introduce the session with a quotation by the Director of the International Labour Organization, General Guy Ryder. He says, given the gravity of the situation, and the situation is obviously the three simultaneous crises that we are focusing, although he is in particular focused on the crisis created by pandemic, by COVID-19 pandemic. So given the gravity of this situation, the global economy needs investments in a human-centered recovery, which strengthens the capacities of people to benefit from change, reinforces the institutions of work so that everyone is properly protected, and boosts the jobs of the future with decent work for all. Indeed, currently we are undergoing three simultaneous crises. Is the crisis generated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused a huge economic recession, which has brought unprecedented levels of unemployment, unprecedented in the sense that we need to go to a world war to face such a situation. And at the same time, we are also experiencing the climate crisis. The effects of changing temperature are faced and are felt by each and every country in this world, and they are translating into billions of economic losses and unfortunately millions of lives lost. Now we need to think how we can recover in a way that it is sustainable. And it is my understanding that beyond fiscal stimulus that boost aggregate demand, this crisis calls for transformative public investments that shape a sustainable, fair digital transition and leverage private sector investment and create jobs. Of course, we are faced with this difficult trade-off, which request an answer to whether countries should provide stimulus spending in order to provide immediate support to maintaining business as usual versus transformative spending focused on accelerating the transition to a job-based inclusive society. I believe, and this is something that we will discuss in this session, that we need transformative change. We need transformative change that will enable fast protection of the vulnerable, but also invest in the transition towards a sustainable future, and future that will be co-designed by all stakeholders, including the labor force. And including the labor force is not just in general nice quotation. It means upskilling and reskilling in order to keep up with the pace of the technological advancements brought by the fourth industrial revolution. In this session, we will also examine the national level job guarantee program as an affordable, cost-effective, and financially feasible strategy to ensure the right to work and promote full employment with dignity. One proven model of such a program is the India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And of course, one of the major obstacles to full employment is the mistaken belief that these programs are unaffordable and therefore unsustainable. However, in this session, we will discuss whether this is true or not by bringing in the high levels of unemployment and how they can severely impact food and nutrition security, physical and mental health, education, violence, crime, drug usage, political stability, and so on. I will stop here by just highlighting our 5 focus points and introducing the first speaker. Our first focus point is the right to employment and its center place in strategies for human security. The second, successful job creation strategies and programs. As the third focus point is the assessment of real social cost of prolonged unemployment. The fourth, financing public job creation programs. And the last one, decentralized implementation of national programs to optimize community development. Mr. Lee, Dr. Lee will focus on the first 2 points, and let me just reintroduce him. He's the director of the Employment Policy Department at ILO, which this department leads ILO's actions for promoting full and productive employment by developing integrated employment, development and skills policy. And before this position, Mr. Lee was the special advisor to the Deputy Director General for Policy on Economic and Social Inputs. And he has provided advice, but also has a very exceptional analytical work on policy development across a range of economic, employment, and social inputs. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Very well.
Okay, good. It's really the honor actually for me to be here with such a fantastic panel members. What I'm going to argue today is that as the agenda suggests, we really want to make sure, or the global leaders in particular, is putting these jobs and employment issues at the central place for the human security and human development. Let me begin with some very basic things here. We know this work is sustaining us, basically. It's the way we meet our material needs, and then that's the way of escaping poverty, and also this is the way of the building decent lives. But this is not just about the material needs. We know that the work actually gives us a sense of the identity and belonging and purposes. So if the work can also expand our choices and also allowing us to glimpse optimistically into our future. And also important thing of the work is this is holding the collective significance by providing the network of connection and interactions, which actually forge the social cohesion. So the way we are organizing our work and to the marketplace and major role in determining the degree of the equality of our society can achieve. So in a sense, the good jobs has a very strong positive externality if I use the economic jargon. But another very important aspect is that having jobs is not sufficient. We know the work can be very dangerous and unhealthy and poorly paid and sometimes unpredictable and unstable. So rather than expanding our sense of possibility work may have, work actually can make us feel trapped and literally and emotionally. And also for those actually unable to find work, as you know, this is a source of the exclusion. So in a sense, the lack of job and also poor job can have a very strong negative externalities. And I also mentioned that the concept of the employment we have is very narrow sometimes, excluding lots of the socially useful activities, for example, care work, and it's also undervalued. It's very important to expand our notion or concept of the employment and work to cover all this broad range of the work. That's important. This is why the ILO Constitution, already 100 years old, that basically says the universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based on the social justice where workers are provided jobs with the rights and protection and decent working conditions. Here, I think nothing is inevitable. For example, digital economy, it has a great potential, of course, creating jobs, but at the same time, the risk of destroying the decent jobs. If we leave this to this current course, digital economy is likely widen both regional and gender divides. And for example, platform economy can create decent jobs, but at the same time, could we create almost 19th century working practice and new generation of the digital day laborers? So the final outcome will very much depend on what policies we are actually we adopt today. This is also why actually from the very beginning of the pandemic, we actually called for job-focused responses and also job-rich recovery. Let's remind ourselves about what is a big lesson from the previous crisis, especially global financial crisis in this context. The lesson I want to highlight here is that unless you put the jobs and employment at the center of crisis response and recovery, job recovery would be very painfully slow and also uneven, which in turn threaten their lives, workers and families, and also the very foundation of the society. So what can we do? I mean, for the job creation, I would argue three interlinked pillars of the human-centered approach as a necessary condition. I said necessary because so many factors, including extraneous and unforeseen factors, determine the actual outcomes in jobs in both quantity and quality. But these are very important, three necessary conditions. Starting point is, not surprisingly, as Chair, you have pointed out, the training and skills. But I would like to broaden this issue of training to the investment in people's capabilities. In here, we strongly advocate lifelong learning for all, which will enable people to acquire skills and reskills and upskills, but not just once, but through their lives. So we know the technology and industry continue to evolve, which also means all necessary support should be given to workers for adapting themselves to this continuous evolution. And lifelong learning, of course, is absolutely crucial, but not sufficient. Basically, we do not want to train workers for the job which do not exist. So this leads to my second pillar, which is quite a difficult question of the boosting labor demand, which basically boils down to the issue of the transformative and strategic investment. I said transformative and strategic because there are clearly a large, I would say, the growing room for future investments towards the area of the economy that advance jobs and gender equality and sustainable development, at the same time providing excellent foundation for high value-added activities. Healthcare sectors and social services is such areas which is clearly and painfully revealed during the pandemic. Investment in digital and infrastructure and green economy are another examples. In the case of low-income countries, making such investment in rural economy is crucial. As you can imagine, this strategic and transformative investment require very strong public and private partnership, which I will say the role of the public investment is particularly important today when the overall economy and the private investment is suppressed. Some may wonder, I mean, this kind of public investment may crowd out the private investment, but I strongly believe, once again, at this particular moment, there is a huge opportunity for public investments to crowd in the private investments. Of course, to make all this happen, we need a strong institutions and policy coordination and social dialogue. For instance, how to finance lifelong learning and infrastructure investment, and how to transform the monetary and fiscal policies to support these investments. Ensuring the employment is main target, like prices and inflation for monetary policies, for example, and also putting jobs at the center of the fiscal and public investment decision, and also a new or renewed social contract, which gives the working people a just share of the economic progress and respect for their right and protection against risk in return for the continuing contributions to the economy. They are all very crucial, but in reality, they all remains a daunting task, which requires a very serious actually discussion and actions by global leaders. Thank you, I stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. Indeed, positive externalities for good jobs deriving from good jobs, but poor jobs have negative externalities, significant negative externalities. And we definitely need to extend our notions of jobs and employment. I will focus on the three characteristics of the important elements that we need in order to recover from this pandemic with regards to employment, training, and upskilling, reskilling throughout the lives of the workers, because we have a continuous revolution. Second, the transformative investment towards sustainable investments, green and digital, and the need for rural investments, regenerating agriculture for the less developed countries, and your third point, job center and jobs to be the center of fiscal decisions and fiscal measures. Indeed, thank you very much, very informative. And if you allow me just to reinforce what you are saying, we already have evidence that return to normal economic stimulus will be unsustainable and economically inferior to a green stimulus. And we know that sustainable energy can create 4 times more jobs than those lost. And the energy transition related investments would yield net job gains in all the regions of the world, including those where fossil fuel jobs are now concentrated. So I thank you so much for this very important and firm contribution towards the transformative interventions in the labor market and with regards to employment. Now I would like to quickly move to our second panelist, a woman who has contributed a lot to issues that have to do with analyzing economic analysis of employment, focusing on full employment. Professor Pavlina Cherneva, who is a professor of economics at Pratt College and a research scholar, as I said before, at Levy Economics Institute. She specializes in modern monetary theory and public policy. I consider her book, The Case for a Job Guarantee, to be the ultimate guide. Really, you have to read. It's a must read. It solves a lot of issues that we are discussing in the public and political debate and multilateral institutions debate. Is the ultimate, this book is the ultimate guide to the benefits of one of the most transformative public policies being discussed today. She frequently speaks at central banks on modern monetary theory and macroeconomic stabilization policies, and her current research focuses and evaluates the impact of unemployment on growth, income inequality, and public health. I also enjoy, I find very useful reading her work on interpreting Keynes' policy approach to full employment. And she has been recognized for this work by the Association for Social Economics with the Helen Porter Prize in 2012. Professor Cherneva, I hope my pronunciation of your surname is not too awful. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you kindly for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel and to speak about the proposal for a job guarantee. The basic philosophy and the basic motivation behind the book is to make the case that unemployment is very much a policy choice, that it is a choice that public makers make, and that there is an important role for governments, not only to engage in the three pillars that Mr. Lee outlined, but also as part of the last pillar, the job-centered approach, to focus both on public investment and direct public employment. By embracing this capacity, the ability to employ the unemployed, governments can make important steps to secure that right, one of the many rights that were recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that is the right to meaningful and dignified employment. From a macroeconomic perspective, from a bird's eye view, what we know is that the private sector is dynamic. The private sector creates the vast majority of employment opportunities. However, it does not create employment opportunities for all, and unemployment is perennial. Nevertheless, it's not unavoidable. It is perennial in the sense that it does behave a bit like a game of musical chairs. And the existence of unemployment, the lack of decent employment opportunities has created staggering costs on societies, on economies. Unemployment is very expensive. It is linked to virtually every socioeconomic problem that is out there. And we don't just mean the direct costs, the cost of poverty alleviation, but we also talk about those more elusive, non-pecuniary costs, not just loss of dignity, but also mental, physical health costs, the impact on future generations, what it means for a community to lose its economic life, the blight that it brings. These are costs that are already baked in. They're there, they're already paid for. And the job guarantee is the direct employment solution that flips the script and says that if we're going to be committing resources, it is more productive and useful to create the employment opportunities that are missing in the economy for the unemployed. And so the public sector becomes a partner in job creation by providing a basic public option. So that is what the job guarantee proposal is, that governments use their fiscal powers to create direct employment for the unemployed in the public service sector for the public good as a matter of permanent policy. And in this sense, the job guarantee is a federally funded but locally administered public employment opportunity that can harness the power of the community, the ability to assess their own needs, to co-create, as we just discussed, those employment opportunities that will serve those very communities that are suffering the blight of unemployment. So the job guarantee is also a voluntary employment opportunity. It's not the old model of requiring people to work for their benefits. In fact, it is a new paradigm of thinking about what it means to secure dignified employment and how to embrace people's input participation in co-creating that future. I want to say just a few things about the job guarantee proposal, that it's not just a job creation policy. It no doubt is that as well. We are faced with perhaps what looks like a very protracted jobless recovery as a consequence of the pandemic. But working people are always taking the brunt of these various crises. It's not just this pandemic. It wasn't just the financial crisis. It could be a garden variety recession. It's working people that lose their livelihoods. And so it is, the job guarantee is a structural policy. It's a way of public sector responding by providing employment to the unemployed when they need them, a basic public job option. As such, it not only guarantees the right to employment, but it becomes the economic stabilizer that returns the economy back to normal quickly, that does it without tolerating the enormous social and economic costs of unemployment, without abdicating to the inevitability of unemployment, but by putting the unemployed to into public service employment projects that can remedy the very many social needs that we have that go neglected for a long time. So it is a it's a structural policy that provides economic stabilization, that expands in downturns, but also shrinks as we are able to then transition people out of employment into other employment opportunities. So it is a genuine employment safety net. It is also a labor standard. Minimum wage policies, for example, while very much needed, are not entirely effective if people cannot find the employment opportunities, even the very basic employment opportunities that provide basic wages. With a job guarantee that commits to a living wage floor for all, that provides employment with guaranteed benefits, we establish what constitutes what represents the standard for a decent job that provides decent remuneration and decent benefits. That then becomes the standard that the private sector will then meet. So it is a genuine, effective minimum wage policy. It's a labor standard for benefits, as I said. And finally, it's also prevention and preparedness program. Imagine what our preparedness response would have been if we had a policy of direct employment on standby in the midst of a pandemic. How many corners of the world lack the infrastructure to respond with mobilizing on short order, contact tracers, public health support. So it is a structural policy that allows us to also address not just the scourge of unemployment, but these various other social problems that we're faced with. And this is the reason, that's what I will conclude with. This is the reason why the job guarantee, at least in the United States, was called perhaps the most crucial component of the Green New Deal resolution. It has been recognized by climate activists as a critical component in that transition to a green future because it embeds the justice in the social justice movement. It recognizes that it is the most vulnerable workers that lose their livelihoods in various types of transitions. The green transition will be one of them, but it ensures that they will not be left behind, that they will be participating in that greening process by participating in the job guarantee. From the days of Roosevelt, the job guarantee was always green. It always attended to public needs, to environmental concerns, and to human concerns. And so green, I think, is we have to broaden our view of what green means. That is not just caring for the environment, but caring for people and for communities. So just to end, unemployment is paid for, and we have two choices before us. We either pay for employment or we pay for unemployment. In that sense, the job guarantee is very much affordable because the costs of unemployment are already baked in our system. But also we have to recognize that countries have fiscal space that is unutilized, that we have fiscal powers that must be mobilized to address the public good and the public need. And the job guarantee is not a panacea, but a critical piece of the broader safety net as we conceive it to move forward to a more sustainable, more humane future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We need to decide whether we want to pay for employment or unemployment. Indeed, a very important contribution. Unemployment is a policy choice. And as you said, we need a job-centered approach, and we need the public sector to become a partner in creating employment in the public sector. And this job guarantee program is not just guaranteeing a job, but it's guaranteeing a decent job that will have positive social, environmental externalities. It is voluntary, and it is rooted firmly in the just transition, in being able to make the transition to a sustainable future in a way that is co-designed by the participants, and it is inclusive of everybody. Thank you so much for your contribution. Our next panelist is Olga Yerova. She's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. She brings in an amazing combination of leadership and diplomatic skills with her deep knowledge of the region, deep knowledge of the challenges and opportunities of the region, with a strong focus on building and partnerships among key stakeholders with the United Nations, is co-creation and inclusiveness of all relevant stakeholders. Ms. Olga Yerova has been previously serving at the UN as a permanent representative of Slovakia to the international organizations in Geneva and Austria. And she was previously president of the Slovak Millennium Development Goals. Ms. Olga Yerova, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phoebe. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, dear guests. It's really my great pleasure to address this distinguished audience. My special appreciation goes to the United Nations office at Geneva and the World Academy of Art and Science for providing an invaluable platform to discuss global leadership issues, namely economy and employment that we are just now discussing. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about unprecedented challenges. Our focus has to be, and now is, I believe, shifting towards opportunities to build back better. Policies aimed at reviving the economy and stimulating employment while respecting planetary boundaries should be at the core of our efforts. And clearly, the challenges and uncertainties caused by the COVID-19 pandemic should serve as a wake-up call. For instance, according to the ILO monitor, there was a 14% drop in global working hours during the second quarter of 2020. And this is equivalent to the loss of 400 million full-time jobs. While these figures are gloomy, they highlight the need for all countries to undertake deep reforms towards a more sustainable and resilient economic recovery that, of course, works for everyone. The pandemic has definitely slowed down progress towards the sustainable development goals, and we need to renew and reinforce our commitment to them. As we see from this discussion, the various angles can be taken tackling this issue. For instance, Mr. Lee was speaking about training, reskilling, Paulina about structural policies and minimum wage policies, together with the guarantee for the decent jobs. I would like to focus on one specific area of UNEC's work, and that is innovation. Innovation is essential for sustainable development and the main means to achieve the targets of SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. Let's first take a look at the context in which today's policymakers, economic actors, and other stakeholders in international organizations, think tanks, and academia are operating. Global trends will continue to transform our societies, including how we create value, how we work, how we exchange, and how we govern. And rapid technological change, increasingly accessible and affordable high-speed connectivity, and the rise of platforms will speed up ongoing developments such as structural change, deindustrialization, servicification, and the importance of intangible assets such as data and skills. All of this is happening against the backdrop of a continuously unsustainable development path. The limits of planetary boundaries are becoming clearer and clearer to all of us. We must find effective ways to meet current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. Now, very close to my heart is circular economy, and transitioning to a circular economy is key in this process. We need to change how we manage our resources, how we make and use products, and what we do with them after we use them. This would not only bring us closer to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, but it would also promote a thriving economy that benefits everyone. Recognizing the role of circularity in accelerating the achievement of the SDGs, the 56 member states of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe have decided that their 69th Commission session, which we will have in April 2021, will be held under the theme Promoting Circular Economy and Sustainable Use of Natural Resources in the UNEC region. Clearly, the transition towards circularity will not be easy, especially against the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis. The challenge will be particularly pronounced for the most vulnerable segments of society and the economy. I therefore would like to call upon all of you, leaders in governments, international organizations, academia, and think tanks, and also the private sector, to harness the power of innovation in addressing this challenge. I'm very pleased to note that our EC member states, including those with economies in transition, recognize this clearly. They share a strong commitment to innovation and technology. They invest heavily in skills. They work hard to promote and facilitate trade and attract foreign direct investment. So now, what can we do to assist countries to harness the power of innovation? Innovation means experimenting with ideas that use physical, digital, and biological technology to transform how we produce, consume, and interact, and ultimately how we meet the SDGs. Innovation is driving force of the fourth industrial revolution. New business ideas and technologies promise not only radical gains in efficiency and productivity, but completely new economic opportunities, as well as solutions that will enable us to consume more while ensuring resource efficiency and sustainability. Economies, and including economies in transition, could leapfrog to the latest technologies and standards, bypassing intermediate stages. Let me give you two examples. First, connectivity and digitization. They can create endless new opportunities. They have already empowered citizens, transformed work, created new business models, and accelerated innovation. But there is still huge untapped potential, and its realization will greatly benefit the most vulnerable segments of society. And the second, the rise of the platform economy. This will continue, especially on the consumer side. It is increasingly possible that for most of the things we buy and own, we'll be able to rent them when we need them, from power tools to cars to our homes. This will reduce resource use while creating new opportunities for consumption and, of course, also jobs. Yet, these opportunities do carry some risks. These are centered around two sets of issues. First, the level and quality of employment, skills, and education. This comes back to Mr. Lee's presentation. And second, higher inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth within and across countries. And let me briefly address each of them in turn. First, regarding the level and quality of employment, skills, and education, today's context of rapid change has given rise to precarious and contract employment. And this is truly challenging, particularly for those with low levels of skills or with increasingly outdated skills. COVID-19 has just shown us how fast seemingly solid skill set and jobs become obsolete. Second, higher inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth within and across countries. Knowledge, skills, governance, and infrastructure gaps between developing and developed economies are bigger. They will affect countries in transition to a significant extent. It will no longer be enough for countries to enter global value chains through labor-intensive, low-skilled manufacturing and services. They need to aim higher while paying close attention to developing the capacities to learn and innovate. Governments have a key role to play in ensuring that innovation-driven growth will be inclusive and sustainable. Labor unions and experts in social policy also have to explore ways to fulfill their mandates. Let me flag a few entry points, policy options, and possible policy directions for governments. Education and social policies need to protect the vulnerable while developing the right skills. This requires a comprehensive learning strategy through educational learning in schools, families, communities, and the workplace. Governments must align these efforts with industrial innovation and trade policies. And given the rise of the gig economy with contract-based, precarious employment, social policies need to be redone to provide adequate protection to all citizens. Policymakers need to adopt clear and feasible national innovation strategies with objectives to enhance digital infrastructure and strengthen the societal knowledge base. Competition and regulatory policies should ensure that the benefits of innovation are broadly shared throughout society. And ultimately, governments will have to change the way they regulate. They will need to foster close collaboration with businesses and civil society and better understand why and what they regulate. And this is indeed a tremendous challenge ahead. At UNEC, we are proud to make a number of contributions. For example, UNEC hosts international policy dialogues on these issues. UNEC also conducts national innovation for sustainable development reviews and the regional innovation policy outlook for Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus. And last but not least, as part of our next annual Regional Forum for Sustainable Development in March, we will co-host a session with ILO. It will allow experts from the region to exchange experiences on the topic building back innovative, inclusive, sustainable economies and providing decent and productive jobs for all. Let me conclude. This will be a flagship session under Cluster 2 Prosperity, and I look forward to welcoming you all to this session in March next year. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Phoebe.
Thank you very much, Olga. Indeed, our transition, our recovery, as you said, should be based on innovation, or at least innovation who should have a crucial role. Global climate neutrality will basically be mobilized through decarbonization and investment in renewables, and innovation is crucial there. Through circular economy, as you said, is a very important model indeed, because it does not only create cost savings for businesses, it does not only create quality jobs, it also reduces the carbon footprint and the general environmental footprint. So I agree, it's very important. And the third mobilizer of climate neutrality will, of course, be nature-based solutions. We expect that 1/3 of climate neutrality will be contributed from nature-based solutions, and those investments in nature-based solutions also create jobs. Global neutrality combined with sustainable finance and climate adaptation and resilience projects are all heavily dependent on innovation. And I cherish the fact that you bring in this dimension into our discussion. I myself I'm directing the EIT Climate Kick of my country, and I'm heavily involved in the Central Kick, which is an innovation accelerator towards a climate neutral economy and a society, the biggest in Europe, the biggest accelerator in Europe towards this dimension. So thank you very much for your amazing intervention. Our last but definitely not least panelist is Ambassador Umei Padia. If I pronounce the name correctly, it is kind of strange. You know these names, you read what they do and what they write, and when it comes to pronounce their surnames, it becomes quite difficult. I apologize for that. So Mr. Padia is Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations Office in Geneva, a permanent representative to the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, and a resident representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Geneva. He serves as the co-chair, among many other things that he does. He serves as the co-chair of the group of Friends of Research for the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime in Vienna, and also serves as a focal point to address challenges faced by delegations from small and developing countries. And he also works on the implementation of the measures on the use of modern technology at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Mr. Paida, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanduri. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And I have to say, I'm quite overawed by being among this fantastic slate of speakers who have deep experience in this issue. But I can say that for Singapore, where we're a small island state with no natural resources, the nexus between economy and employment is crucial, because our historic focus has always been on our human capital, because we don't have any natural resources. Now, I wanted to start off by saying that there were so many important issues raised by the previous speakers. I think it's quite clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has raised the stakes. And that's why today's World Academy meeting and the subjects we're discussing are so relevant to some of the issues that we need to think forward. Now, the fall in incomes that we're seeing from the COVID-19 pandemic is probably going to be the most severe we've seen in a century. And so this is not just a public health crisis or even it's a deep social crisis, and fundamentally it's a jobs crisis, what we're going to see. And this is the central economic problem, as Ms. Bard has said, Dr. Bard has said earlier on. It's not just about COVID-19, this predates it. We can even predate it before the global financial crisis, but let's be clear, there's a real prospect now of prolonged high unemployment in many economies, and it's not at all assured that we will get back to tight labor markets, even with the traditional macroeconomic policies working the way they should. We're also going to face probably long-term stagnation of median incomes, and that's also very, very clear, which we see in a whole range of advanced economies, apart maybe from my country and perhaps Sweden being the exceptions. I think we're going to see this, and there's not going to be any turnaround unless we revive productivity growth. Also, another broad point I would make before I drill into some of the key points I want to focus on is that we really face the challenge, which is worsened by the current COVID-19 pandemic, of addressing the trend towards a sort of very polarized job market, with more jobs like a barbell being created at the high and low skill ends of the labor market and fewer in the middle, and the growth of an insecure gig workforce. So all of these are the major sort of macro trends, difficult challenges we have to face, and overcoming all this triptych is going to be very, very difficult. Now, I have to say that for Singapore, what is so crucial is that particularly at the time of pandemics and global disruptions, we fundamentally have to learn new skills. We talk about upskilling, we talk about reskilling. One fundamental issue for Singapore is the issue of deep skilling. What is deep skilling? Deep skilling is trying to build a structure where we teach people from an early age to learn how to learn. And this is particularly important in an era of technology where we can be disrupted very quickly, where new developments come in. We need to learn how to learn so that we're not simply, particularly for blue-collar workers, thrown out on their own. And I think it's easier for those with, I would say, more advanced skills to reskill. But unless we start in an early stage to create lifelong employability, as Singapore tries to do, rather about lifelong employment, which is the old paradigm, and using deep skilling and teaching people to learn how to learn, I think we are going to be faced with a chronic job crisis and all the attendant problems that follow on that. Now, for Singapore, we try as much as we can to create a meritocracy of skills. And it's not just about a hierarchy of grades, the credentials you learn, which will become outdated at a certain stage, but trying now, at least we aspire to create a meritocracy of skills, deep skilling, and to send a message that people need to re-gear or risk being left behind. We try to support ongoing professional education. This is something which we feel you have to have lifelong learning. And this is a mantra that's very easy to sort of put out there, but it's how you operationalize it, how you put it in practice. And so for Singapore, we try to encourage our citizens to have individual ownership of skills development and lifelong learning. There are subsidies, there are work skill courses, and people are given credits to basically do this. So we want to prepare tomorrow's unemployed and put them in tomorrow's jobs ahead of time. Now, again, this all sounds like rhetoric, but again, it's how do you operationalize this? If we look at COVID-19, during this difficult period, we have tried to launch some exceptional measures, various programs to augment support to job seekers by enhancing training support and increase traineeship positions. So this is essentially short-term for now, but these incentives will hopefully sort of like put us in good stead. But broadly speaking, our various job skills program benefit at least 10% of the population, and that is almost half the working population. I wanna end because I know we're running short of time, by really focusing on one fundamental issue that we have to think about very, very deeply. And that question is, if we don't really figure out a way to rally around a multilateral approach to dealing with this global jobs crisis and figuring out a new paradigm, a new way of approaching this. We have the G20, we have the ILO, the DGIO, but I think we may need a global jobs czar, a global deep skills jar to change the whole paradigm of how we think about jobs and skills and learning how to learn. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Kanjori, for this opportunity to share my views in Singapore's perspective.
Thank you so much for your intervention. It is crucial that we create a framework, an international framework, that we can support this upskilling. But I will take from your presentation something that I've heard only today, this deep skilling, learn how to learn. This is so important because all of us, as Mr. Lee, Dr. Lee identified, we understand the need for transformative investments towards lifelong training programs, but the underground basis that is needed for a successful lifelong upskilling structure is to know how to learn. And it is important that we teach that it is really the basis for creating lifelong upskilling. And I will coach you on that from this day onwards. So from our conversation, deep skilling is important. We need to pay for employment through a job guarantee program, given the positive externalities created by quality jobs, as Professor Cherneva has identified. We also need to focus on innovation and especially circular economy, which is a structure that has huge power to mobilize sustainable, inclusive, and equitable economic growth. And this was excellently explained by Mrs. Alkayerova. And the last quotation from our panel would be that we need to invest in what makes us, what allows us to inherit a future that is that enables future generations to live not just as we live, but better that we live. All these recovery packages are financed basically by future generations. At the moment, what we are doing is that we are borrowing from the future in order to recover from this pandemic and be able to continue our economic and social lives. It is not just that there is an economic, financial case for a sustainable recovery in accordance to the SDGs and the climate agreement. It is also that there is a social case, a case that proves that we need to recover sustainably according to the SDGs because they are this is how an equitable, human-centric recovery should look like. But also, at the end of the day, we also have a moral obligation, like the moderator of the previous session identified, to the future generations to inherit a world that is sustainable and resilient and human-centric. I will just close with a quotation from the Lancet Commission on COVID-19. I am honored to lead the task force on jobs-based green recovery, and our basic recommendation is that this economic recovery should support the transition towards sustainable and inclusive societies based on the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. Public investment should be oriented towards sustainable industries and the digital economy, and should spur complementary private investments. And a major goal of the recovery should be an unprecedented commitment to reskilling and upskilling people, including the skills to prepare workers for a digital and green economy. We need to co-design a just and sustainable future. We have a moral obligation to the generations following ours. Thank you very much for following us in this session.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience. I'm now going to take over as the moderator of the next session on focusing on environment and climate. Thank you so much to the UN office at Geneva, UNOC, and also the World Academy of Art and Science for hosting this conference online today, talking about global leadership for the 21st century. And we need that leadership. Clearly, 2020 has been the year of planetary emergency. We're facing a triple crisis for health, climate, and nature as well. We have some very distinguished panelists today with us, starting with Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, the president of the Club of Rome, Mami Mitsutori, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General, Special Representative of the SG4 Disaster Reduction, Mr. Michel Jarraud, who is here with us. I can't see Michel for now, maybe he's joining later. Mr. Bruno Pozzi. Bruno, very nice to be in touch again. You are the head of the UNEP and Europe office here in Geneva. Oliver Greenfield, convener of the Green Economy Coalition. Welcome, Oliver. I can see you are with us. And Anna Hanhausen, very pleased to have you with us you're going to be our youth ambassador today. You are an event coordinator working on plastic oceans in Mexico and also a mentor. So welcome. We're going to start very soon, trying to catch up on some time. So let me just give the floor right away to Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who is going to talk to you about the Planetary Emergency Plan. We've been working together on the Planetary Emergency Partnership for more than a year now. It's been growing from 30 to 300 partners, including partners from the UN, from governments, from academia, civil society, business as well. And it's been an amazing adventure working all of us together to deliver impact for people and the planet. Over to you, Sandrine.
Thanks so much, Elise. And I'm trying to share my screen, but somehow it's not enabling me. I don't know who is the host now. There we go. Okay. Can you see this? I'm just checking. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Super. Okay, so let's start with the beginning and very quickly to set the stage. And as Elise said, we're really excited to be here and to be with all the distinguished speakers because you're really bringing a different perspective to something that we call the planetary emergency. And that's really the convergence between climate and nature and also pandemic tipping points. And what we're trying to do at the Club of Rome and working with partners is to leverage 50 years of thought leadership for people, planet, and prosperity. We have to take the premise that came already from the limits to growth. And if you read this slide, I'm sure Anna will recognize it as a youth ambassador. Already in 1972, we indicated that this supreme effort is a challenge for our generation. It cannot be passed on to the next. The effort must be resolutely undertaken without delay, and significant redirection must be achieved during this decade. That was in 1972, and here we are 50 years later. And we know that since then, we now have not only one singular crisis, which is the health pandemic, but a convergence of a series of crises that are breaking down the healthy planet and healthy people that we actually want. We're moving not only from a climate change series of disasters into a series of pandemics, into a series of nature loss and ecosystem loss. And this is what we call a deep systems crisis. And it's rooted in a number of interconnected global challenges. As I've indicated, all of these different crises are predominantly being created by the interaction between too much destruction and moving into the planetary boundaries, high density living, and also trade, all affecting the way in which we're now starting to see a culmination of different tipping points. So where are we today? We really feel that 2020 marks the beginning of a decade of action, but this is also the time that we're going to see the greatest economic transition in history. We've got social tipping points from mass movements, political progress, market forces, and technological disruption, all culminating with our natural tipping points: zero carbon needs, zero loss of nature needs, zero poverty, and zero pandemics. That's where we want to go. So how do we do that? How do we ensure that the globe doesn't move back rather than moving forward? And we talk a lot with, obviously, governments who are saying that we have to build back better. Well, our argument, and my argument, is clearly you cannot build back glaciers that have already melted. You cannot build back old growth forest. We have to totally rethink the way in which we, people and nature and climate, can actually live together, because the climate will continue to change. Let's be clear. Many of our members at the Club of Rome, distinguished scientists, are already saying that we're too late. But we don't want to just talk about the emergency. We want to talk about the emergence. So this planetary emergency plan that actually we developed 2 years ago with the Potsdam Institute and WWF turned into a large movement where we brought in, and as Elise indicated, several different types of partners, organizations at first, that turned into 300 organizations working together. But it also turned into a series of pledges and influencing a series of different jurisdictions. So we have now 1,788 jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency. We have 80 countries that have actually signed a pledge for nature and people. And we have 33 countries now, not just 31, that have moved on and also made these declarations. So what we're trying to say is, yes, we're in an emergency, but if we commit to the protection of global commons and the way in which we introduce very clear targets and timetables over the next 10 years, we could potentially make it. But these are big shifts. For example, by 2025, halting all conversion of wetlands, grasslands, and savannas, or by 2030, declaring critical ecosystems as global commons. These are just some of the examples of the 10 key commitments that we have for the global commons. But we need to link that to the 10 urgent actions for the transformation. And this is where all of you who are sitting on the panel and those who are listening each have to start to make a determined call, because we have to do 3 key things: create just and equitable societies, again, looking at those social tipping points with the planetary tipping points, understanding where the stewards of our land truly are, but then transforming energy systems, very clearly pulling out of fossil energy, tripling our investment into renewables, and ensuring that we have a strong carbon price. But we often talk just about carbon pricing and not the full costing of externalities. And that means we need to totally shift to a circular and regenerative economy. This is the third key pillar of what we call the 10 urgent actions for the transformation. So both shifting and decreasing by half our impacts, our consumption and our production footprints by 2030, but also internalizing those externalities and ensuring that we have proper roadmaps. This leads us, we think, to what's now very much well coined as the 21st century well-being economics. Myself and Eileen MacLeod, who used to be the Minister of Environment for Scotland, published this new thinking around 21st century well-being economics and the way in which we can introduce this to recovery and renewal and resilience in Europe. And it takes those original key indicators that I spoke about in terms of the convergence of tipping points between economics, social, and environmental. It means that we need to have core indicators for each of those. And we already have some governments that are doing this. We also have cities that are starting to implement donut economics. Very similar type of approach where we start to see how we can interact with our economies without having an impact on our planetary boundaries. And I think it's really important, as one of our members indicated just recently, David Cordon. And if you look at these two hands, that our lives are in our hands and they're in the hands of so many people. Together we can do this. We need a re-articulation of human development for the 21st century. We're not in 1972 anymore, but the same issues are coming to haunt us. We have to redirect our purpose from growing GDP to securing the well-being of people and planet. And now is the time to focus on measures of well-being. So these are my concluding remarks. Where does that leave us? How do we emerge from emergency? And how do we transition to sustainable prosperity? We have to guarantee the human dimension. But within this time of important considerations for lives and livelihoods, we have to put in place a decade of action. And that means we need to address three key areas: the political landscape. And here in Europe, we are moving forward, though in some cases not fast enough. If you look at the pushback on policy, on common agricultural policy, for example. We also have China and now finally the US coming back. We have biodiversity and climate high ambition goals, and we have increasing support for what we call nature-based solutions. But the big players are missing. The US is still not completely here, and we have Brazil and Russia. We have to look at the business landscape. We have to build on the Paris collaboration, ensure that we truly do have price parity and shift to renewable energy, and look at all of the different value chain experience that we're now starting to get from COVID. And then the most important, if we're going to make this work, and I hope in our panel we'll be able to discuss this further, we must bring people on the journey. We can't just focus on Fridays for the Future, Extinction Rebellion. We need to bring in the younger generation, but all generations and all different actors. That means we need to have enhanced collaboration, and we need to ensure that we truly put in place a democratic process that empowers people to feel that they're part of the change. So I'm going to leave it at that, Elise. I hope that I've struck some thinking from all of you and that we can really unpack how you emerge from emergency together. Thank you. And I'm going to
Thank
try.
you so much, Sandrine. And on Saturday, we also celebrated the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And this planetary emergency is also about a climate emergency. We've heard the UN Secretary General calling on all countries to declare a climate emergency. So that was a very clear signal. And there were 24 countries that did commit to carbon neutrality, but we know it's not enough. We need more climate ambition and more action at the domestic level, at the local level, on mitigation, but also on adaptation. So resilience really needs to be at the center of our recovery plans in 2021. And now we're going to hear from Mami Mitsutori, who is actually the special representative to the SG, who's been calling for a climate emergency declaration on the weekend. We would like to hear from you in your experience. You have this amazing network of countries, but also cities that have experience in building resilience. How do we make it happen, and how we can these efforts be scaled up in 2021? And what can we all do to support you in this tremendous task?
Thank you very much, Ms. Buckle. And the scene has been set so eloquently and very powerfully by Ms. Dixon DeClave. I'd like to thank being invited to this very exciting session and this important event about leadership and how we can together overcome all these global issues. And as I was introduced kindly by Ms. Buckle, I'm in charge of disaster risk reduction in the United Nations, which is about prevention. And so I'd like to ask you to allow me to start talking about disaster risk reduction because it's very much related to the issue of environment and climate and the impact of extreme weather events. The impact of degraded environment can be really seen in how disasters are destroying our lives. And I don't think really that there is nobody who can ever object that reduced number of people who die from disasters or affected by disasters or economic loss, damaged infrastructure by disasters, reducing all this, who would object to it, right? And I don't think that people would object that, yes, we need a plan, as Elise just mentioned, and a strategy to have in place. And those plans should have multi-hazard early warning systems because as Ms. Dixon DeClave said, we're not being hit by one disaster or two, but multiply right now in COVID-19 with hurricanes, with earthquakes, with floods. And what is happening is that we're all being impacted, but in particular, the least developed countries and the small island developing states, which do not have resilience because they don't have the resources to build them, they are being affected terribly. But there is actually a global blueprint, a global plan to deal with this, which has the targets and goals that has been started to been talked about today. These are targets and goals to, as I just mentioned, reduce the number of people dying, affected. And it's called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030, which was adopted at the same time, same year as Paris Agreement. Actually, it was one of the first of the global agreements that were all adopted in that year, 5 years ago. But I must say that, of course, we have these goals, the Paris Agreement, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals, but the devil is in the detail when it comes to implementing these. And it is really about what is the quality of leadership that is going to allow us to really implement these goals. We have been campaigning for one thing, and this is about governance. This is about good risk governance, because we think that in order to really generate leadership for anything, but something as difficult sometimes as prevention, you really need to have good risk governance. And our campaign did actually start long before COVID-19 outbreak. And sadly, COVID-19 has shown us that those governments which had a better plan, a strategy, a better risk governance structure was successful in having less people dying or being affected. And we see that, those governments or those, let's say, people who have not been very successful in having risk governance, good risk governance, the achievement of the SDGs is becoming very difficult. And this is what the Secretary General has already said, because really nothing undermines SDGs like disaster. Let me just give you 3 examples. SDG number 1, poverty eradication. So many people lose their homes and thrown into extreme poverty because of extreme weather events, but now by COVID, because they're being displaced. SDG number 11, sustainable communities in cities. Ms. Buckle just mentioned about the cities. Yes, the cities are at the forefront of resilience and response recovery from disasters. But actually what is happening is that the population growth, rapid informal urbanization is fueling the devastation of environment. And importantly, the SDG number 13, climate action. 90% of the major disasters of the past 20 years are related to extreme weather events, to climate change. And these are the floods, the storms, the wildfires that we have been seeing every year, but very much this year as well. And so how do we tackle all this? The people who drafted the Sendai framework, the member states, they put the main responsibility for protecting their citizens, they put it on the governments, which needs to have strong political leadership. But the important thing is that Sendai framework says it has to be a whole of society approach. We are all responsible. And now in the middle of ongoing pandemic, we will be making a very big mistake if we are not all conscious about this, that this is, because COVID-19 is also a disaster that has been written into the Sendai framework caused by a biological hazard. We must all be mindful that if we don't have the courage to recover better, if we don't all take leadership under a good governance structure, then we won't have a resilient, we won't have a green, we won't have an equitable recovery from COVID-19 disaster, and we will be missing an opportunity because we can change this crisis into an opportunity. And this is all about good risk governance. Now, we know from a survey that we conducted some years ago at UNDRR, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, that persons living with disabilities are rarely consulted about their needs in disaster settings. And I think, unfortunately, this is true for other vulnerable groups. So the key leadership issue for us when we're taking action on climate and environment is to really break down those barriers that are against inclusion so that we can co-own the leadership. And that is the only way that we can really have a whole of society approach. The practice of disaster risk reduction, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and environmental protection, it has to be people-centered and encouraged by engagement and representation of all groups of society. And we are going to have, over the next year and a half, convening a series of regional global conferences which are called platforms for a reason, because they bring together governments, they bring together the cities that was just mentioned, bring together the civil society, the private sector, academia, media, UN system, and importantly, the most vulnerable groups. So we do need to bring in the voice of the young people who are so frustrated with this vested interest that many people have, many institutions have, which resist change, and they are calling from change. We also have to bring in the women and girls who are really impacted by the climate change to start with, but now with COVID-19. And the energy and idealism of these people who are most vulnerable, to bring them in so that they are part of the change, they are part of the solution, is the only way that we can really build a more resilient planet. So whether the goal is to save rainforests or improve flood control or rein in greenhouse gas emission, the important thing is that we need to encourage more diverse and distributed forms of leadership. And that is the only way we can really make a difference in this decade of action. We have already finished 1 year almost, which has been a devastating year, but we all need to do better, and it's a shared responsibility. It's a shared co-owned leadership. So thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this very timely debate on the future that we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mami, for this really inspiring speech. And you're totally right. People at the center, women at the center, youth at the center. I'm so glad that Anna is with us today, because you don't need to be 50 or 60 years old to be a leader and make change happen. We now have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Michel Jarraud, former head of WMO. Michel, I remember meeting you about 10 years ago in your office when I was working with Julia Martin-Lefebvre, preparing for the Bali COP. And at the time already, you were telling us this is really urgent for all species, including human beings. We're now in 2020, and I think that climate impacts have been accelerating and triggering multiple tipping points around the world. The Amazon forest burning down, the ice melting very quickly, the coral reef also disappearing in Australia. So the emergency is even more present today. There's been a lot of changes on the geopolitical front. Luckily, the EU and China has been have been forging ahead, the EU with the Green New Deal and China announcing their new carbon neutrality plan to be reached by 2060. And we're so happy now that the US is coming back on board with the Paris Agreement. So Michel, can you share your wisdom with us, and what is it that we can expect for COP26 in Glasgow next year? What would success look like for you?
Well, thank you very much, Elise, for your introduction. You're right. When we talk together many years ago now, the issue was urgent, and it's even more urgent now because very precious time has been wasted in the meantime. And I want really to thank very, very sincerely the World Academy of Art and Science and the UNOP for organizing this conference, because this is a theme which is often perceived as important, but very few meetings have addressed the core of the issue of leadership, because it can mean many things, When we talk about changes required in leadership, it is important to first understand what are the problems, the key problem, the urgent problem that we want to solve. And as was mentioned by a number of interventions, both in this session, but also in the other sessions before, we are facing a new context, which is where there is a multiplicity of crises, many of them interconnected, and interconnected in a very, very complex way. And many of them have a global dimension. So we're not talking only about local decision, we are really talking about a problem with a global dimension. We saw also in the beginning of this new century, a re-emergence of populistic, nationalistic approach. My country first, my region first, my community first, or even my personal interest first. This is extremely worrying from my perspective for handling some of these global issues. In parallel with that, we have also been witnessing a very serious decline in the concept of solidarity, and I will come to that in a minute. This crisis, as we could see from the pandemic, but also from many other crises, health, terrorism, refugees, economics, food security, and of course, environment, they cannot be solved in isolation, even by the largest countries. They have to be solved in a common way, in a collaborative way. Of course, in my next points, I will focus on the angle from the climate change and environment issue, but they are all, as I said, interconnected. Now, focusing on this angle, it is impossible to study climate variability and change without a global perspective, without global exchange of data. And all countries, even the largest one, even USA, even China, even Europe as a whole, get more from this exchange than what they give away. Mami was talking about disaster reduction. We cannot do proper early warning without a global exchange, a global perspective. So this is absolutely fundamental. And this leads me to the next point, because we are also talking about the future or the changes required to multilateralism. But we cannot deal with this issue in a bilateral fashion. UN is just under about 200 members. Now, with 200 members, to deal with this issue, you would need about 20,000 bilateral agreement. This is utterly inadequate. So we need to properly analyze what needs to be changed, improved in the multilateral system. We also need, and that was clear from the various interventions, because they have all looked at the issue from different angles, we need a multidisciplinary approach. This is done to some extent, but it is not done to the extent which is sufficient to address these issues. Most major challenges associated with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, actually I could say all of them, are cross-cutting. They cannot can be handled in isolation. And at the international level, you can argue that the structures we have in place which were developed after the Second World War with a very thematic approach, are not sufficient to do that. It doesn't mean they are useless. Actually, quite the opposite. They are still very useful, but we need also to develop approaches to deal with these cross-cutting issues. And there are a number of examples. Actually, disaster reduction is one of these examples in the UN system with the strategy for disaster reduction. There's another example in the UN system about the coordination of water issue with UN water. There are a few examples of what we can do. But what I want to also, the point I want to make is that this is not sufficient to deal with it at the international or intergovernmental level. Often when I was meeting ministers or ambassadors, they were saying, you need to better coordinate. And I said, yes, of course, I fully agree. By the way, how do you do it at the national level? Because you see, we need to have a similar mapping at all levels, international, national, but also more and more at other levels like the region, the city, all the levels where key decisions are being made. We need to encourage cooperation across disciplines, and some of these disciplines do not have the culture to work together. I was listening with great interest to the presentation by Sandrine, and she made a similar point. For example, when it comes to climate change, the climate scientists and the economics do not have a strong tradition of working together. We need to encourage that more. Efforts have been made, but they are not yet sufficient. We need to encourage, and that's about really leadership as well, managers, decision makers, to deal with complex matrix. Of course, we are all familiar with the complex of matrix management, but here we are dealing with an incredibly complex matrix where all the elements of the matrix interact with each other. You cannot address all the interaction, impossible. So you need to identify what are the key ones, the one where you can have the best reward by investing more on these elements. So a new governance is required at all levels, and that implies a new approach to leadership. Now, let me develop a little bit further what it means for decision making. When it comes to climate change, decision making, oh, sorry, I'm talking too much, and Elise tells me. Decision making, the past is no longer a good indicator for the future. So we need to base decision on scenarios, on probabilities, on including the principle of precaution. And one of the most important points, and we saw the damage of that point not being taken into account, is that decision makers have to take into account the facts. The real facts, not the alternative reality. They have to take into account the scientific evidence, like for the climate, the information provided by IPCC. They need to integrate longer time horizon, not short-term horizon. And we need, and I will not develop that further because it was mentioned by so many people, we need to involve so many new actors, not only government, private sector, civil society. I will not develop that further. We need to have heads of states and government who act more as statesmen, not as politicians. We need to have people with a vision which goes much beyond the next election or re-election. There have been encouraging signals from USA recently and from other, but it requires much more. It's not only about USA, it requires much more from many other countries. So my conclusion, Elise, I'm stopping there, is that I also, the last point I want to make, let's put back solidarity at the center of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michel. And you're right that all these crises are interconnected. So we really need to address them through a cross-sectoral approach and also through a lot of solidarity, working all of us together, coming from our various communities. There's also a question for you and for Mami for later on how we can develop innovative proposals to support adaptation in the face of these multiple crises, COVID-19, climate change, malnutrition. So that's also coming to the same point. We're now going to turn to Mr. Bruno Pozzi, who's the Director of UN Environment Program here in Geneva. Bruno, it was a pleasure to work with you and your colleagues last year on the Nature-Based Solutions Coalition, supporting the leadership of China and New Zealand. And the goal was really to scale up nature-based solutions and to advance this action agenda for climate, people, and nature. So trying to deliver these multiple opportunities and win-win-win opportunities for climate, people, and nature. Indeed, nature can help us to achieve at least a third of the emission reduction needed to to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement. Investing in forests and ecosystems can help us to reverse the biodiversity loss and also create lots of jobs and support livelihoods. And this is a time of crisis, and we desperately need these solutions. So Bruno, can you tell us a bit more about this nature positive recovery? What are the solutions? How can we scale that up in 2021?
Thanks a lot, Elise, and really a pleasure to be on this panel, and thanks to the organizers for giving us the space to engage. And I must say, before I start with the small points, the few points that I've prepared, I'd like to come back on what Michel just said and really underline indeed the need to have a strong multilateralism that deals with environmental matters. I often say the 21st century will be a century of environmental multilateralism or will not succeed. So it is the task of our generation, the next, and maybe the one after the next. So it is a long-term engagement, and we need to build this as leaders in the multilateral world. There's going to be a bit of repetition, of course. It has been said we are at a very critical juncture with the triple planetary crisis, and yes, it is biodiversity loss, it is climate change, this pollution, this is afflicting our Earth, and the basis of our sustainable development that we are putting at risk. We've had the second hottest year on record in 2019. We see that 2020 might be the warmest actually ever recorded, and we know that the air that we breathe all around the globe is not safe most of the time, and we know that there is a risk of a mass extinction for more than 1 million plant and animal species. But we're not changing. We're not changing fast enough. And then on top of it, we've seen crises like COVID-19 with the virus, nature, sending us a message that our way of life based on producing, consuming, polluting is not sustainable. So let's do something, and let's try to change that 5 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And before I touch on nature-based solution, which indeed can provide a large part of the answers, I'd like to touch on where we stand with today the green gas emissions. And UNEP, we try to, like WMO and others, we try to bring data together, to bring the science together and give policy advice, being this interface between the science and the policy design. And therefore we've just issued 3 reports that are really alarming. There's the emissions gap report that was released last week that shows that even with the slowdown, even with an economy which still has to recovery, we're not going to make a real difference if we don't act. We are going to witness a drop of up to 7% of carbon dioxide emissions this year, but this will translate in a mere 0.01 degree reduction of global warming by 2050, which shows the extent or the magnitude of the challenge in front of us. And so we still currently, 5 years after the Paris Agreement, heading for at least a 3-degree temperature rise in this century, which is really dangerous and really making the planet not sustainable. To get back on track, we will need to cut around 1/3 of CO2 emissions by 2030. And to get to 1.5 degrees, which is the aim of the Paris Agreement, we need to halve them. So how do we do that? And how do we decrease the use of fossil fuels, basically? We need to transform, we need to look at transformative models and change our economic, the way we do the economy. Economy is really the link of our societies, but the way we do it is unsustainable, both in terms of production and in terms of consumption. And this is shown in the production gap report, which is another report that we've just published, which shows that we need to decrease fossil fuel production by around 6% every year until 2030 if we have a chance of meeting the targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming by the end of the century. And a last report that I want to mention is a report we've just published as well on buildings and constructions, which shows that the way we build, the way we develop, and we know that there's demographic pressure as well on our planet Earth, is contributing very strongly to the CO2 emission. The building and construction sector is about 38% of the total global CO2 emissions. So with all of this, it gives a very, very dark picture, but there is a strong potential for a post-pandemic green recovery, where we put nature at the center, and when we build a green recovery that could, if we use a nature-based solution, if we use a new set of governance, and if we we've put environment protection and restoration at the center of our economic decisions, we could cut up to 25% of the emissions by 2030. So meeting then a lot of the goals that have been set by the global community. Nature-based solution, policies is the mix that we need to look at so that we lower the carbon consumption. This implies as well energy efficiency, this has been said, and a transition away from the fossil fuel, which means as well redirecting investments and getting the finance sector to support innovation and transformation away from fossil fuels. At government level, it means as well a number of fiscal responses that the pandemic and the recovery plan give us the possibility to address. And with all of that, then there is a chance that we can really meet the targets, and that we can leave a planet that will be on the way to recovery. And this is also important for us as leaders to think of. It is a more than a lifetime commitment. It is a number of generations that will have to commit to the planet recovery, because the risk of falling back, of going back, will always be present. So we need to act boldly, we need to act strongly, but we need also to transmit this desire of change to the next generations, and then hopefully we can continue living on this beautiful planet. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bruno. We don't want to go back to business as usual for sure. We want to move beyond that and go towards a truly systemic transformation. We're now going to hear from Oliver Greenfield. Oliver, you are leading the Green Economy Coalition, and there was also a comment in the chat now saying where the first thing we need to transform is our lifestyles. So how do we go beyond this crazy race for more and more production and consumption? And also, how do we move beyond just GDP growth towards a well-being economy? There are countries like New Zealand that have developed a well-being budget. How do you see this transformation happening, in particular in the context of the post-COVID-19 recovery?
Thank you. Okay, so the Green Economy Coalition is largely a civil society network and working on economic reform, and it also includes the UN. So this is about leadership. And I very much liked Sandrine's opening, but there's one thing, there's a slight nuance. There was a comment that we need to take people with us. I just want to challenge that slightly, because I think that I agree with the sentiment, but I actually think that the changes we've seen in the last few years have largely been people driven. I don't think it's about people being brought with us. I think people are driving this agenda. I think the rise of social activism the Fridays for Future, the Extinction Rebellion, we have seen that has changed the dial. And so people are leading this. And I think that we should probably remember what leadership means. For me, politicians should serve the people. Businesses should deliver what people want. And the leadership that's coming from our people are driving this agenda and making it more transformative. So I think that what we're seeing in those social movements is a global culture change. And I suggest to you that culture change eats politicians and businesses for breakfast. And if you get on the wrong side of the culture change, you will be out of power or you will be out of business. And the other thing is on those social activists, people don't want to be marching Those children do not want to be striking on a Friday. They're saying, politicians, do your job. You know, what we have is a huge army of people, ordinary people, that want to live in a different way, that want different decisions, that want a different economy. And I would suggest that the greatest threat to democracy itself is its failure to deliver economic democracy. And so when we are challenging ourselves with this transition, we fundamentally need to understand how we connect and reconnect with people's lives, with people's decisions, with people's choices, and with enabling them to live better lives, to live lives that are more fulfilled, less vulnerable, and decent jobs. So where are people? They want jobs. But this COVID crisis has put us in a position where we are seeing economic collapse between 5 and 40% or 50%, depending on which country you're in. Job crises. This transition that we have got such a short span to do. The language of Sidrine is this planetary emergency. I mean, in many places, this sort of commensurate to a war effort. Well, there's no unemployment in a war effort. We have to re-engineer our energy systems, our food systems, our transport systems, our financial systems, our economic systems, our governance systems, what matters, what measurement. We plan, it is an extraordinarily short amount of time to retool our whole economy and our whole lifestyles and the provision of all of those activities. There's an innovation opportunity, which is immense. An absolutely extraordinary opportunity for all businesses, as long as we start lining up the policy direction and the money. And that requires us to think stimulus in the short term and structural in the long term. And it also requires us to think explicitly about one key question. We're back to this people with us, not more than with us, people driving this, people owning this, people manifesting it as their own implementers of this in their own lifestyles, in their own choices, and in their own voting. So the most important issue for us, and we've done a lot of work on what needs to reform the economy. And if you want to have a look at 20 policies that government should be taking up, have a look at the Green Economy Tracker, collaboratively developed through social dialogue over 10 years. Thousands of individuals and organizations around the world have defined that. But what matters most is this idea of reigniting democracy, reigniting ownership that politicians serve, that businesses deliver, to a new culture change. And for that, we're starting to really experiment with this idea of the risk. We have another crisis risk, which is the inequality crisis. We also have a crisis in trust. And so this moment is an opportunity for all of us to start to rebuild trust. And in that place, we're starting to see processes of dialogue. We run our own green economy dialogues to enable society to engage in the policy process. But deliberative democracies, social citizens' assemblies, all of these new mechanisms to reignite societal ownership, societal leadership, and a clarity of what society needs and wants. And reigniting those democratic processes and putting in place, really making sure that, for example, in the Green Deal, European Green Deal, the success of the European Green Deal is not that it comes, and it's a brilliant piece of work, theoretically, brilliant piece of work, but its success is not that it is rooted in a commission, but that it is rooted in communities. If communities see their lives improving, we won't have the yellow vests. We won't have all the kickback. We will have people who see their lives improving, their opportunities to develop. I'll give you a practical example. We could talk about moving to renewable energy, but you've got a choice. You could either have an out of town huge renewable array of solar PV, or you can make this community energy where community gets the benefit. Community earns some money. Community is part of the planning process. And those are choices that we make based on whether our community is involved. Community owns the solution, and community is telling politicians that we're prepared to put up with the cost of this. We're prepared to support you through investment cycles or policy cycles that are too short term to address these structural changes, because we are benefiting, because we see our lives improve, because we see well-being improve, and because we see our opportunities of decent work being understood and captured. So my main message here is, look, the answers of how you reform an economy, largely we know it, and it's summarized in places like Green Economy Tracker. Largely we know it. The biggest issue is to overcome trust. And that requires us to be explicit in how we engage with people so that they are the leaders of this. And politicians remember they are serving and businesses are delivering. And I just want one final shout out, because this is a UN leadership thing. UN have created a group, one UN group, Partners for Green Economy, PAGE it's called. It's got UNIDO, UNDP, UN Environment. It's been around for at least 10 years. So they've been working with governments for that. And I think that the one UN approach, and I agree completely with the previous sayers, multilateralism matters. Going it alone will not solve this. UN has shown that the PAGE work, it needs to be much bigger, much more invested in. I'm closing down. But solidarity also means recognizing the voice of people will be what really makes a difference here. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and fascinating to listen to you. This big challenge, how do we reunite democracies? And there's a question there about declaring a global constitutions for the environment. I don't know about that, but I know there are projects going around about a citizens' assembly at the global level, but also various citizens' assemblies in various countries to try to restore the trust in democracy. And that will be a challenge for sure for 2021. Let me now turn to Anna. Anna, you've been leading some really impressive work to protect the oceans as these prisoners of silence in a way. We sometimes forget that the life underwater is as important as the life on Earth, and our survival depends on these oceans that are also pumping carbon and trying and helping us with global warming. So can you tell us about your experience? And I'm going to give you the closing remarks as well, because we are running out of time. So as the youth leader, you will have the privilege of closing this panel. So please do share your reflection on the whole session today as well. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you so much, Elise. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. Am I audible? Just to check.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I have been focused on ocean conservation for almost 3 years now, and there are many different projects that are being done across the world. So I would like to speak on behalf of most of the youth. So regarding the current crisis right now, I think from my point of view, and speaking for a growing number of the youth across the world, the current crisis, both sanitary and environmental, portray a relationship with nature. For decades, the way of developing has been with complete disregard of planetary boundaries. And the sanitary emergency is especially worrying for the youth who know that we are likely to experience such a crisis in the future. With environmental degradation come more pandemics. So this is likely to happen again to us in many years. The climate emergency also hinders our right to both a healthy and a resilient environment. And as Ms. Dixon de Cleve eloquently said in the beginning, it is a challenge of our generation, and we are on a breaking point to take effective action. This has been said on many generations, but I think now it's truly the last one that has the power to do significant change. And countless policies have been implemented. Everyone here on the panel knows that you're better than me, but only a few countries are on track with their commitments, for example, to keep their temperature under 1.5 degrees. We need binding agreements that force all countries to change. So how can we make all this happen? How can we ensure this right to a resilient and a healthy environment? I think the key action is systematic change. And it takes into account two main things that Ms. Dixon de Cleve also introduced, talking about the donut economics. And it's taking into account the limits of resources we can use in order to have a healthy environment, and the quality of life, which meets basic needs of the entire population. This systemic change has many intrinsic actions and ideological shifts that include inclusion, because we can't think of solutions that only benefit a few. Innovation and technology really need to take into account those who live in poverty or marginalized communities. As a whole, we need to recognize that what happens to one happens to all. And to humanity as a whole, we need more empathy in all solutions and in leadership. I think we also need to think of long-term solutions, solutions that consider what's best in the long run and not only what will save us for this year or this decade. We really need to think of future generations. And as I was saying before, meeting the needs of everyone, because those living in poverty or marginalized communities are expected to feel the worst effect of the climate crisis and are probably not going to focus their efforts on the climate crisis if they need to be concerned on if they're going to have food that day or where they're going to get drinkable water. Finally, I would also like to talk about education and how the youth across the world are entitled to know the issues they will face in the future due to environmental degradation in order to adapt accordingly. And I think what is amazing is that the youth across the world are doing amazing projects and amazing initiatives that had never been seen before, especially as social media allows these movements to grow at a much quicker rate. However, there are some challenges we face when leading these projects. On one side, projects need to have a common goal to increase impact. We need collaboration between not only different projects, but between different generations, different countries, and different groups. We need these types of dialogues among youth across the world who are doing different projects in order to find solutions that are beneficial to everyone. I think the youth needs to be included and listened to as key stakeholders for all environmental issues, as we are the ones who will face the hardest consequences. And youth involvements need to go even further into local, national, and global politics, as well as boardrooms. Our voice needs to be listened to. And I think we need more mentorship programs such as the POP movement, which inspires youth to take action through knowledge. We need to empower all the youth, as Dr. Greenfield was talking about just before me. We need to re-engineer, but in order to re-engineer, we need to make STEM more accessible, and we need to make women and new generations and those living in marginalized communities join STEM careers in order to re-engineer solutions. I think this global call for an ideological shift shows that we can prioritize the environment and that action is needed at an urgent level. As Ms. Dixon DeCleve was saying in the beginning, only 33 countries have stated the climate crisis as an emergency. I think it's time for more countries to do so because it truly is an emergency. And it is very exciting, going back to the current COVID crisis we are facing, it is very exciting that science has achieved a series of vaccines within a year of the outbreak. But we, the youth, hope that climate action is viewed with the same sense of urgency so we can have effective solutions implemented within a year. I think if it was done for such a big crisis as COVID, it can be done for an even bigger crisis and that threatens our future even more, as is climate change. And for my final remarks, I think some really interesting ideas were talked about in this panel, and many of them focused on ideological shifts and things we need to do at many levels. We need to do it at a local, national, and global level. We need to have more empathy. We need to be more resilient. We need to think of trust. We need to rebuild this trust and really create a better community for everyone. I think all the speakers put it in the best words possible, but we really need to work together and in order to empower all generations to become leaders and take action.
Thank you so much, Anna. So inspiring. And as you say, we need solidarity, empathy, and also there's this motto, one for all for one. I think that's reflecting also your thoughts. I don't know if there are more questions. We're kind of running out of time. We started 15 minutes late. If you have questions, this is the moment. Otherwise, I will hand over to Sandrine for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Elise. And thank you, Anna, really. First of all, for your inspirational remarks, but also for all the incredible work that you're doing. And, you know, there are so many young people on the front lines who are trying to figure out this complexity. And I think that we're all very cognizant of that fact. So we really are indebted to you, but we also need to work together through an intergenerational dialogue so you don't feel alone. And I just wanted to conclude because several people in the chat have asked questions around the presentation, the plan. So yes, we'll make the presentation available. Please read the Planetary Emergency Plan, and please join if you want to get active, our Planetary Emergency Partnership that Elise is facilitating. And we're really collectively trying to bring together the voices of change and also act. And maybe just to conclude to Oliver's really good point about people and the journey. Yes, there is a huge growth in the activist community, but as someone put in the chat, there are many forgotten people too who are not part of this journey and who really feel like they are on the front line of our changes. What we need to do is get better at demonstrating exactly what you've indicated and so many others, that vision that the future is actually better than the present. And it's much more collective, it's much more equitable. And as I often say, many people talk about the fact that we have to go back to business as usual. But for many, business as usual has not brought them happiness. It's not brought them the prosperity that they deserve. In fact, that's the majority of the population. So let's remember that business as usual for this generation means they're going to make less than their parents. That business as usual for this generation means increased suicide rates and increase mental instability. That is not an offer of a bright prospect for the future. So together we can try to work on how we can emerge from emergency. This Planetary Emergency Plan gives some really clear targets and timetables linked to the emergency at hand. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to working with all of you. And thank you so much to Elise for moderating this panel and for all of you for joining us and those who wanted to ask more questions but weren't able to because we also overran. Have a lovely day. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining from everywhere around the world. I saw comments from Pakistan, also a call to the UN to have these sessions translated. And thank you for the good, positive spirit, all of us working as one team for one planet. Thank you. Have a good day. I will now hand over to the UN team.